Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that falls over a world just before it dies. Not the silence of peace, not the quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the survivors emerge to survey the wreckage. No, this is something altogether different. This is the silence of a planet holding its breath, though it does not know why. The birds stop singing. The insects cease their droning chorus. Deep beneath the ocean floors, the great leviathans of the deep go still in the water, their ancient instincts screaming at them that something is wrong, something so fundamentally threatening that even creatures who have never known fear in their billion-year evolutionary history are suddenly, terrifyingly afraid. This is the silence that precedes the arrival of the Tyranids. And if you are hearing this silence, and if you are standing on a world where the birds have gone quiet and the air itself feels heavy with an unseen pressure, then it is already far, far too late for you. Your world is about to die. Everything you have ever known, every person you have ever loved, every building you have ever walked through, every tree that has ever cast its shade upon your face, all of it is about to be consumed, devoured, broken down into raw biological material and absorbed into a swarm so vast, so incomprehensibly enormous that the human mind simply cannot process its scale. Welcome, friends. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because today, we are going to talk about the single most terrifying faction in all of Warhammer 40,000. We are going to talk about the Tyranids, the Great Devourer, the Swarm without end, and I'm going to explain to you, yes, in painstaking detail, why they represent the single greatest existential threat that the galaxy has ever faced. Greater than chaos, greater than the Necrons, greater than anything else that lurks in the darkness between the stars. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You might be sitting there, perhaps sipping your evening tea or lying in bed with your headphones on, and you might be thinking that chaos is the real threat. After all, the ruinous powers have torn the galaxy in half with the Great Rift. Abaddon the Despoiler launched 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium. The Chaos Gods are literal deities of unfathomable power who exist in a dimension of pure psychic energy. Surely they represent the greatest danger to all life in the galaxy. Or perhaps you believe it is the Necrons, those ancient, deathless machines who once ruled the galaxy in its infancy. They possess technology so advanced that it borders on magic. They can manipulate the very fabric of space and time, and they have been sleeping beneath the surface of countless worlds for 60 million years, waiting to reclaim what was once theirs. Surely beings who can unmake reality itself are the ultimate threat, and I will grant you that both of these factions are terrifying. Both of them represent existential dangers that would give any sane person nightmares for the rest of their natural life. But here is the thing that separates the Tyranids from every other threat in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it is a distinction so profound, so fundamentally disturbing, that once you understand it, you will never look at the setting the same way again. Every other faction in the galaxy, no matter how powerful, no matter how malevolent, has limits. Chaos needs souls to feed upon, and worshippers to sustain its power. The Necrons, for all their technological supremacy, are a dying race, their numbers finite, their bodies slowly degrading over the millennia. The Orcs, as ferocious and numerous as they are, can be outmaneuvered, outthought, and contained within specific regions of space. Even the Eldari, in their various forms, are constrained by their declining numbers and the ever-present hunger of Slaanesh. The Tyranids have no such limitations. They are, in the purest and most terrifying sense of the word, infinite. What the galaxy has seen so far, those massive hive fleets that have carved paths of destruction through Imperial space, yet those continent-spanning swarms that have stripped worlds bare to the bedrock, all of that, every single encounter the Imperium has ever had with the Tyranids, has been nothing more than the outermost tendrils of something so massive that even attempting to comprehend its full scale is an exercise in cosmic horror. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle in your mind like a stone sinking slowly through dark water. The battles that nearly destroyed the Ultramarines at Macragge, the war that almost wiped out Craftworld Yanden, the siege that brought the Blood Angels to the very precipice of annihilation on Baal. All of those apocalyptic conflicts, all of that death and destruction and heroic sacrifice. And what the galaxy was fighting against was essentially the equivalent of someone dipping their fingertip into a pond. The main body of the Tyranid swarm is still out there, somewhere in the lightless void between galaxies, and it is coming. That is what makes the Tyranids the real threat. Not their individual power, though that is formidable enough. Not their numbers, though those are beyond counting. It is the simple, inescapable mathematical reality that they cannot be beaten. Not truly, not permanently. Every other enemy in the galaxy can be fought to a standstill, driven back, contained, or destroyed. The Tyranids can only be delayed, and delays, no matter how heroic, no matter how costly, are temporary things. So let us begin our journey into the darkness. Let us trace the path of the Great Devourer from its first appearance on the galaxy's edge to the present moment, like where hive fleet tendrils are closing, like the jaws of some impossibly vast predator around the heart of the Imperium itself. Let us examine every facet of this species, from the microscopic organisms that dissolve a world's atmosphere to the titanic bioconstructs that can go toe-to-toe with Imperial titans. Let us understand, truly understand, what is coming for everyone and everything in the Milky Way. And let us do so quietly, in the comfort of wherever you happen to be, with the knowledge that understanding a threat is the first step in appreciating just how dire the situation truly is. This is the story of the Tyranids, and it is a story without a happy ending. Before we can understand the scale of the Tyranid threat, we need to understand something fundamental about the nature of the galaxy itself and the place the Tyranids occupy within it, or rather, outside of it. Because the Tyranids are not from the Milky Way. They are not native to this galaxy in any sense of the word. They are invaders from beyond the rim, travelers who have crossed the incomprehensible distances between galaxies, drawn to our own by forces we are only beginning to understand. And that simple fact, that single piece of context, changes everything about how we should view them. You see, every other major faction in Warhammer 40,000 is, in one way or another, a product of this galaxy. Humanity evolved on Terra. The Eldari built their empire among the stars of the Milky Way. The Orcs were engineered by the Old Ones to fight in a war that took place within these galactic borders. Even the Necrons, ancient beyond measure, are children of this galaxy. They were born here, they fought here, they sleep here. The warp itself, that roiling dimension of psychic energy, where chaos festers and feeds, is fundamentally connected to the life that exists within this galaxy. The Tyranids come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere so far away that the light from their origin point would take millions of years to reach us. They are the ultimate outsiders, the uninvited guests at a party that has already gotten far too crowded and far too violent. And they were not drawn here by accident or chance. Something called them. Something so bright, so luminous in the psychic spectrum that it burned like a beacon across the intergalactic void, guiding the Tyranids toward the Milky Way with the precision of a lighthouse guiding ships through a storm. Many scholars within the Imperium, those few who have studied the Tyranid threat closely enough to form educated theories, believe that the beacon which drew the Tyranids to our galaxy was none other than the Astronomicon itself, that impossibly powerful psychic signal projected by the Emperor of Mankind from the Golden Throne on Terra, the very light that allows the Imperium ships to navigate the warp, the signal that binds humanity's interstellar civilization together, may also be the thing that called the galaxy's greatest predator to its door. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. Humanity's greatest achievement, the thing that allows its civilization to exist at all, may ultimately be the thing that dooms not just humanity, but every living thing in the galaxy to annihilation. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us start at the beginning, or rather, let us start at the edge, because the beginning of the Tyranid story, as far as the inhabitants of the Milky Way are concerned, takes place on the galaxy's outermost fringes, in a region of space so remote and so sparsely populated that entire star systems can go centuries without being visited by another living soul. The exact origin of the Tyranids is unknown. That bears repeating, because it is important. We do not know where they come from. We do not know what galaxy or what galaxies they have already consumed. We do not know if they are a naturally evolved species or the creation of some unimaginably powerful intelligence that designed them as the ultimate biological weapon. We do not know how old they are, though some estimates suggest they may predate the Milky Way itself. What we do know is that they are here, they are hungry, and they have no intention of stopping until every scrap of biological material in this galaxy has been consumed and incorporated into the ever-growing biomass of their hive fleets. The term Tyranid itself comes from the first world where the Imperium encountered them in full force, an ocean world called Tyran in the eastern fringe. It was there, on that remote and largely insignificant planet, that humanity first came face to face with the horror that had been lurking beyond the rim. As an Adeptus Mechanicus research station, a small outpost staffed by tech priests and their servitors was suddenly and completely overwhelmed by an alien force unlike anything in the Imperium's extensive records of Xenos species. The world of Tyran was stripped bare. Every living thing on the planet, from the smallest bacterium to the largest ocean-dwelling creature, was consumed. Even the atmosphere was affected, as Tyranid organisms broke down the very gases that supported life. By the time Inquisitor Fidus Kryptman of the Ordo Xenos arrived to investigate the disturbance, the planet was a lifeless husk, a ball of barren rock floating in the cold void of space, utterly devoid of anything that could be called alive. But Kryptman was a thorough man. Meticulous investigator who understood that the disappearance of an entire world's biosphere was not something that could be written off as a natural disaster or the work of a known Xenos species. He searched the ruins of the research station with painstaking care, and in a bore shaft drilled some 3,000 meters below the surface, he found something that would change the course of galactic history. A data codex, hidden there by the station's commander, Magos Varnak, in the final moments before the station was overrun. Varnak had known, in those last desperate hours, that he and everyone under his command was going to die. But he also knew that the information he had gathered about the attackers was too valuable to lose. So he hid it, and buried it deep in the rock, where even the most thorough biological consumption process would be unlikely to reach. The data that Cryptman recovered from that codex was the first comprehensive record the Imperium ever had of the Tyranids. It described creatures that defied easy classification, organisms that seemed to exist as part of some vast biological machine, each one filling a specific role, each one expendable, each one utterly devoted to a single purpose, the consumption of all living matter. The data described the speed of the assault, the overwhelming numbers, the way the creatures adapted mid-battle to counter the defenders' tactics, as if they were being directed by some vast, invisible intelligence that could see everything and react to anything. Cryptman took this data and he ran. He ran as fast as the warp would carry him. Mullish, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the Imperium at that moment, that what he had discovered was not just a new threat. It was the threat. The one that made everything else. The wars with chaos. The Orc invasions. The Aeldari raids. All of it looked like minor skirmishes by comparison. He raced to Macragge, to the heart of Ultramar, and he laid his findings before Chapter Master Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines. And in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would define the galaxy's future. But before we follow that chain, before we trace the path of Hive Fleet Behemoth toward Ultramar and the apocalyptic Battle of Macragge, we need to understand what the Tyranids actually are. Not just as a military threat, not just as a list of terrifying creatures and devastating weapons, but as a species. As a form of life so fundamentally different from anything else in the galaxy that the very concept of understanding them may be a fool's errand. The Tyranids are not a species in the way that humanity, or the Aeldari, or even the Orcs are species. They are better understood as an ecosystem, a vast, interconnected web of biological organisms that spans the entire length and breadth of their hive fleets. Every single Tyranid creature, from the smallest Ripper swarm to the most enormous Biotitan, is part of this ecosystem. They are not individuals in any meaningful sense. They do not have personal motivations, personal desires, or personal fears. They are components of a larger whole, cells in a body so vast that it stretches across light years of space. At the center of this ecosystem, directing it all with an intelligence that is as vast as it is alien, is the hive mind. And the hive mind is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Tyranid species, more frightening than their numbers, more unsettling than their biological weapons, more disturbing than the speed with which they can adapt to any threat. Because the hive mind is not a single creature. It is not a brain sitting in some command center, issuing orders to its troops. It is a gestalt consciousness, a psychic construct created by the combined awareness of every single Tyranid organism in existence. Billions upon billions upon billions of minds, all linked together through a psychic connection that permeates the warp itself, forming a single, unified intelligence of incomprehensible scope and power. Imagine, if you can, a mind that is simultaneously aware of every organism in a fleet that spans light years. A mind that can coordinate the actions of trillions of creatures across dozens of worlds simultaneously. A mind that remembers every battle it has ever fought, every enemy it has ever faced, every adaptation that has ever proved useful, and can draw upon all of that experience instantly, without hesitation, without error. A mind that does not sleep, does not dream, does not doubt, does not fear. A mind that has only one purpose, one drive, one all-consuming imperative. Consume, adapt, evolve, repeat. That is the hive mind, and it is old. Older than humanity. Older than the Eldari Empire. Possibly older than the galaxy itself. It has crossed the void between galaxies, which means it has been traveling for millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, or of years. In that time, it has consumed everything in its path, every world, every species, every scrap of biological material that it has encountered has been broken down, analyzed, and incorporated into the ever-growing biomass of the Tyranid swarm. The creatures that the Imperium fights today, the Hormagaunts and Carnifexes and Hive Tyrants, are not the original forms of the Tyranid species. They are the product of millions of years of directed evolution, shaped and reshaped by the hive mind to be the perfect biological weapons for whatever enemy they happen to be facing at any given moment. This is the key to understanding the Tyranid threat. They are not static. They do not build weapons and then use those weapons until they break, the way humanity does. They do not cling to tradition and established doctrine, the way the Imperium does. They evolve, constantly, ceaselessly, with a speed and precision that makes natural evolution look like the geological process it is. If the Tyranids encounter an enemy with particularly tough armor, the hive mind will, within a single generation of organisms, produce bioforms with weapons specifically designed to penetrate that armor. If they encounter a species with powerful psychic abilities, they will develop countermeasures. If they encounter a new form of biological material that they have never seen before, they will analyze it, break it down to its genetic components, and incorporate any useful traits into future generations of Tyranid organisms. This is what makes them so terrifying. Every victory against the Tyranids is ultimately a defeat, because every time you fight them, you are giving them information. You are showing them your weapons, your tactics, your strengths, and your weaknesses. And they remember. The hive mind never forgets, never discards a useful piece of data, never fails to incorporate a new lesson into its ever-expanding strategic repertoire. The next time you fight them, they will be different. They will be better. They will have adapted specifically to counter whatever worked against them last time, and you will find yourself facing an enemy that has evolved beyond whatever advantages you thought you had. It is an arms race that the Tyranids will always win, because they have the ultimate advantage. They are not constrained by the limitations of technology or manufacturing or logistics. Their weapons are biological, grown from the raw materials of consumed worlds. It is shaped by a mind that has been perfecting the art of biological warfare for longer than most civilizations have existed. You cannot outproduce them, because every world they consume adds to their biomass. You cannot outthink them, because the hive mind has been solving strategic problems for millions of years. You cannot outlast them, because they are patient beyond human comprehension, willing to invest centuries in the consumption of a single world if that is what the situation requires. The only thing you can do is fight and hope that you kill enough of them fast enough to delay the inevitable. But that is enough about the Tyranids in the abstract. Let us get specific. Let us look at the creatures that make up the Tyranid swarm, the biological horrors that have given nightmares to soldiers and scholars across the galaxy. Because understanding the individual bioforms of the Tyranid species is essential to understanding the sheer depth and breadth of the threat they represent. These are not mindless beasts. These are precision-engineered instruments of destruction, each one designed by the hive mind for a specific purpose, each one a masterpiece of biological engineering that puts humanity's clumsy mechanical technology to shame. At the lowest tier of the Tyranid hierarchy, if you can even call it a hierarchy, are the countless small organisms that form the foundation of every Tyranid swarm. These are the creatures that most Imperial soldiers will encounter first, and often last, on a battlefield where the Great Devourer has made landfall. The termagants are perhaps the most numerous of these basic bioforms, standing roughly the size of a large dog. They are relatively fragile individually, easily killed by a single well-placed bolt round. But they never come individually. They come in swarms of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, a chittering, screeching tide of clawed limbs and snapping jaws that washes over defensive positions like a biological flood. Each termagant carries a symbiotic bioweapon, most commonly a flesh borer, a living weapon that fires beetle-like organisms that burrow into the victim's flesh and consume them from the inside out. Imagine being hit by one of those rounds. Imagine feeling something alive boring into your skin, chewing through muscle and bone with mindless biological imperative. Now imagine that happening to you while thousands more of the same creatures are pouring over your barricades, and the air is filled with the sound of their weapons and the screams of your comrades. Alongside the termagants come the hormagants, bounding, leaping melee bioforms that close the distance to their prey with terrifying speed. Where the termagants provide ranged firepower, the hormagants are the scything blades that cut through enemy lines in close combat. Their limbs end in razor-sharp talons capable of slicing through body armor and even the ceramite plating of Space Marine power armor, given enough strikes. They move with a fluid, almost hypnotic grace, their bodies designed from the cellular level upward for a single purpose: to close with the enemy and tear them apart. They do not tire. They do not hesitate. They feel no pain, at least not in any way that we would recognize. They simply advance, attack, kill, and advance again, until either they or their prey is destroyed. Then there are the gargoyles, winged versions of the basic Tyranid bioform that fill the skies above a battlefield with a living cloud of leathery wings and acid-spitting mouths. They serve as both aerial harassment and reconnaissance, their senses linked directly to the hive mind through the synaptic network that connects all Tyranid organisms. When gargoyles swoop over a battlefield, they are not just attacking, they are observing. Every piece of information they gather, every enemy position they spot, every weakness they identify, is transmitted instantly to the hive mind, which uses that information to direct the swarm with ever-increasing precision. But the basic bioforms are just the beginning, the rank and file, if you will. The real nightmares come in larger packages. The Tyranid warriors are the backbone of any Tyranid assault force. Standing roughly 8 feet tall, they are significantly more powerful and intelligent than the smaller bioforms, and they serve a dual purpose on the battlefield. First, they are formidable combatants in their own right, capable of carrying a variety of bioweapons ranging from devourers that fire swarms of living, brain-seeking worms, to death spitters that launch balls of corrosive acid, to the dreaded bone saws that can slice through virtually any material and carry a psychic charge that attacks the very nervous system of the victim. But their second purpose is even more important than their combat capability. Tyranid warriors are synapse creatures, living nodes in the psychic network that connects the hive mind to its lesser organisms. Without them, yes, the smaller Tyranids revert to base animal instincts, becoming disorganized and ineffective. With them, those same organisms act with coordinated, deadly precision. Kill the warriors, and the swarm around them temporarily loses its cohesion. But the hive mind is not stupid. It never sends just one synapse creature. It sends dozens, hundreds, ensuring that even if some are destroyed, the synaptic network remains intact. Moving up the scale of Tyranid bioforms, we encounter creatures that can only be described as living weapons platforms. The Carnifex is perhaps the most iconic of these, a hulking, tank-sized monster that serves as the Tyranid equivalent of armored support. Originally known as screamer killers due to the piercing psychic shriek they emit as they charge, carnifexes are biological battering rams of terrifying power. Their bodies are covered in thick chitin armor that can deflect all but the heaviest weapons fire, and they are armed with a variety of massive bioweapons, from crushing claws that can tear open the hull of a battle tank to bioplasma cannons that fire superheated streams of organic acid. A single carnifex can break through a reinforced defensive line. A brood of them can shatter an entire fortified position. But even the carnifex is dwarfed by some of the larger Tyranid bioforms. The Trigon, a serpentine horror that tunnels beneath the battlefield to emerge behind enemy lines, is a sight that has haunted the dreams of Imperial soldiers for generations. Towering over even a carnifex, the Trigon generates a powerful bioelectric field that it can discharge at will, frying enemy electronics and cooking anything organic in its path. When it bursts from the ground without warning, emerging in the midst of rear echelon positions, where supply lines and command posts are located, sowing chaos and destruction before the enemy can organize a response. And it does not come alone. The tunnel it creates behind it serves as a conduit for other Tyranid organisms, allowing swarms of smaller bioforms to pour through the gap and attack from an entirely unexpected direction. Then there are the Biotitans, the largest land-based Tyranid organisms, creatures so massive that they rival the legendary Titans of the Adeptus Mechanicus in size and destructive power. The Hierophant is the most commonly encountered of these behemoths, a towering nightmare of chitin and bioweaponry that can stand up to 30 meters tall. It bristles with organic weapons, from massive biocannons that fire projectiles the size of small vehicles to clusters of lashing tendrils that can swat aside infantry like insects. Its body constantly exudes a cloud of toxic spores that chokes and burns anything that gets too close, making it virtually impossible to engage in close combat without specialized environmental protection. Imperial Titans have fought Hierophants on numerous occasions, and the engagements are always brutal, always costly, and never certain. The organic nature of the Hierophant gives it one advantage that no machine can match. It can heal. Damage that would cripple a mechanical Titan can be repaired by the Hierophant's own biological processes, sometimes in the middle of a battle. And yet, for all the terror that these ground-based bioforms inspire, the true power of the Tyranids lies not on the battlefield, but in space. The hive ships, those massive living vessels that carry the swarm between the stars, are marvels of biological engineering that defy easy comprehension. They are not ships in the human sense. They are organisms, living creatures the size of small moons, their interiors consisting of vast spawning pools and digestion chambers and synaptic relay nodes. Each hive ship is a self-contained ecosystem, capable of producing new bioforms, digesting consumed biomass, and projecting the psychic field of the hive mind across vast distances of space. They travel through the void in numbers that beggar the imagination. During the assault on Baal, the homeworld of the Blood Angels, the Tyranid fleet was so dense that it blotted out the stars themselves, casting the entire system into an artificial night that lasted for the duration of the battle. 50,000 bioships, at minimum, descended upon that single star system. 50,000. And that was just one tendril of one hive fleet. Above all of these bioforms, directing them all with supreme authority, are the hive tyrants, the field commanders of the Tyranid swarm. These massive creatures stand roughly twice the height of a space marine, and they possess an intelligence that rivals, and in some cases exceeds, that of the most brilliant human strategists. They are directly connected to the hive mind, acting as its eyes and ears and voice on the battlefield. Every piece of tactical information gathered by every Tyranid organism in the area is funneled through the hive tyrant, which uses that information to coordinate the swarm with terrifying efficiency. They are also formidable combatants in their own right, armed with massive bone swords and lash whips and the full array of Tyranid biological weaponry. A hive tyrant can go toe-to-toe with a space marine captain and come out victorious more often than not. They are the generals of the swarm, and killing one is always a priority for Imperial forces, though doing so is never easy and always costly. And then there is the Swarm Lord, the pinnacle of hive tyrant evolution, the ultimate expression of the hive mind's will made flesh. If a hive tyrant is a general, the Swarm Lord is a supreme commander, a being of such tactical brilliance and combat prowess that it has earned a reputation as one of the deadliest individual organisms in the galaxy. Yes, it wields 4 massive bone swords, each one infused with a disruptive energy that can slice through adamantium and force fields as if they were paper. It possesses greater autonomy from the hive mind than any other Tyranid organism, allowing it to make independent tactical decisions of startling sophistication. And most terrifyingly of all, it is effectively immortal. When a Swarm Lord is killed, which has happened on numerous occasions throughout the Tyrannic Wars, the hive mind simply creates a new one, and the new Swarm Lord possesses all the memories, all the experience, all the tactical knowledge of its predecessor. It is the same being, reborn in a new body, stronger and more capable than before because it has learned from its previous death. Every time you kill the Swarm Lord, you are, in a very real sense, making it more dangerous. Thus, the Swarm Lord has faced some of the greatest warriors the galaxy has to offer, and emerged victorious more often than not. It nearly killed Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, during the Battle of Macragge. It was only through the sacrifice of Calga's entire honor guard that the chapter master was able to escape with his life. The Swarm Lord has fought Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, the oldest living space marine in the Imperium, and has been slain by him, only to return in the next battle, having learned from the experience. It has studied the tactics of the Imperium, the Eldari, the Orcs, the Tau, and every other species it has encountered, and it has incorporated all of that knowledge into its ever-expanding strategic repertoire. Fighting the Swarm Lord is like fighting your own worst nightmare, and because it knows your tactics better than you do, and it has already prepared a counter for whatever you are planning to throw at it. Deep within the hive ships, in chambers so vast and so alien that no human has ever seen them and lived to describe them, reside the Norn Queens. These massive organisms are the reproductive heart of the Tyranid swarm. They are the factories that produce every bioform, from the smallest ripper swarm to the largest biotitan. They ingest the genetic material consumed from devoured worlds and use it to engineer new organisms, adapting existing designs and creating entirely new ones as the tactical situation demands. The Norn Queens are the reason the Tyranids can adapt so quickly and so effectively. They are the biological forges, where the raw materials of consumed worlds are transformed into the instruments of galactic extinction. Every Tyranid organism that exists, every creature that has ever crawled or flown or swum in service to the Great Devourer, was created by a Norn Queen. And every one of those organisms, upon the completion of its function, returns to the biomass pool to be recycled and reformed into something new. It is a cycle of creation and destruction that never ends, never slows, and never wastes a single molecule of organic material. The Tyranids are the ultimate recycling system, a closed biological loop that converts everything it touches into more of itself. But the biological horrors of the Tyranid swarm are only one facet of the threat they pose. There is another aspect, or one that is perhaps even more insidious than the physical destruction they bring, one that strikes at the very foundations of how the Imperium, and indeed every psychic-capable species in the galaxy, operates. That aspect is the shadow in the warp. The warp, that roiling dimension of psychic energy that exists alongside material reality, is the medium through which all faster-than-light communication and travel in the galaxy takes place. Imperial ships navigate through the warp, using the light of the Astronomicon as a guide. Astropaths send messages across vast distances through the warp, allowing the Imperium's bureaucracy to function, however slowly and imperfectly. Psychers of all species draw upon the power of the warp to manifest abilities that defy the laws of physics. The warp is, in a very real sense, the nervous system of galactic civilization. Without it, interstellar travel becomes all but impossible. Communication between star systems slows to the speed of light, which means it becomes functionally non-existent across interstellar distances, and the Imperium of man, already stretched thin and beset on all sides, would fragment into a million isolated, defenseless worlds. The Tyranids disrupt all of this. The shadow in the warp is a psychic phenomenon generated by the sheer presence of the hive mind. When a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a region of space, the psychic pressure exerted by billions of linked minds creates a kind of static in the warp. This static is so intense, so overwhelming, that it drowns out virtually all other psychic signals in the affected area. Astropaths trying to send messages through a warp shadow find their transmissions blocked, distorted, or simply swallowed up by the white noise of the hive mind's presence. Navigators trying to guide ships through the warp in a region affected by the shadow find their vision obscured, their instruments useless, their ability to chart a safe course reduced to nothing. Psychers who attempt to use their powers in the presence of a warp shadow experience a psychic cacophony so intense that it can drive them insane, as the sound of billions of alien thoughts crashes against their minds like a psychic tsunami. This means that when a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a world, that world is effectively cut off from the rest of the galaxy. No calls for help can get through, no reinforcements can navigate to the system, or no information about the impending attack can be transmitted to neighboring worlds or sector command. The planet is alone, isolated, trapped in a pocket of silence, while the jaws of the Great Devourer close around it. By the time the shadow falls, it is already too late. The Tyranids have ensured that their prey has no way to run, no way to call for help, and no way to coordinate with anyone outside the affected area. And the psychological effects of the shadow are almost as devastating as the practical ones. As a hive fleet approaches, whole populations can be plunged into a state of existential dread. The psychic pressure of the hive mind's presence is so vast, so incomprehensibly alien, that it registers on a subconscious level in the minds of every living creature within its range. Yet people who have never had a psychic thought in their lives suddenly find themselves unable to sleep, plagued by nightmares of endless chittering darkness. Latent psychers, those who have some small degree of psychic sensitivity but have never been identified or sanctioned, can be driven to madness or death by the intensity of the shadow. Entire worlds have been plunged into chaos before a single Tyranid organism has even made landfall, the population driven to violence and despair by a pressure they cannot see, cannot name, and cannot escape. It is the ultimate psychological weapon, and it costs the Tyranids nothing. It is simply a byproduct of their existence, a natural consequence of having a psychic network so vast and so powerful that it warps the fabric of the warp itself. Some Imperial scholars have debated whether the shadow in the warp is an intentional weapon of the hive mind or simply an unavoidable side effect of the Tyranid psychic gestalt. The distinction, frankly, is academic. Intentional or not, the effect is the same: isolation, terror, and death. The synapse network is the final piece of the Tyranid command and control puzzle. As we discussed earlier, the larger Tyranid organisms, particularly hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, zoanthropes, and other synapse creatures, act as psychic conduits for the hive mind's will. They are the nodes in a vast psychic network that stretches across the entire Tyranid swarm, transmitting the hive mind's commands to every lesser organism within range. Without synapse creatures, the smaller Tyranid bioforms revert to basic animal instincts. Our termagants will attack the nearest target or flee from danger. Hormagaunts will charge the closest enemy without coordination or strategy. Rippers will simply eat whatever they can reach. This might sound like it makes the synapse network a vulnerability, a weak point that Imperial forces can exploit to disrupt the swarm. And in theory, it is. Kill enough synapse creatures and the Tyranid swarm in the local area will lose its coordination, at least temporarily. But in practice, exploiting this vulnerability is far more difficult than it sounds. The hive mind is well aware that its synapse creatures are targets, and it takes steps to protect them. Hive tyrants are surrounded by Tyrant Guard, blind but incredibly tough organisms whose sole purpose is to absorb damage meant for their charge. Synapse creatures are distributed throughout the swarm in sufficient numbers that destroying one simply causes the affected organisms to fall within range of another. And even when synapse creatures are killed and a portion of the swarm does revert to instinctive behavior, the results are not always what the defenders might hope. Hormagaunts on instinct are still fast, still deadly, and still very, very numerous. They just lack coordination, which means they are unpredictable. And in a battle, an unpredictable enemy can sometimes be more dangerous than a coordinated one. The interplay between the hive mind, the shadow in the warp, and the synapse network creates a command and control system that is, in many ways, more efficient and more resilient than anything that any other faction in the galaxy can field. As there is no chain of command to disrupt, there is no central headquarters to destroy, there is no signal to jam or code to crack. The hive mind is everywhere and nowhere, distributed across billions of organisms, each one carrying a tiny piece of the gestalt intelligence within it. You cannot decapitate the Tyranid command structure, because there is nothing to decapitate. The closest thing to a leader that the Tyranids have is the hive mind itself, and the hive mind is not a creature, it is a concept. It is the emergent property of billions of linked minds, and you cannot kill a concept with a bullet or a bomb or a lance strike. Now, the Tyranids are terrifying enough as a straightforward military threat. Endless swarms of biologically engineered killing machines, directed by an intelligence of cosmic scale, and approaching through a shroud of psychic darkness that prevents their prey from calling for help. That alone would be enough to make them the most dangerous faction in the galaxy. But the Tyranids have another weapon in their arsenal, one that is arguably even more devastating than their military might, because it operates not on the battlefield, but in the shadows, in the underbellies of civilizations, in the hearts and minds of the very populations they intend to consume. It operates over generations, over decades, over lifetimes, and by the time its effects become apparent, it is invariably too late to do anything about it. I'm talking, of course, about the Genestealer cults. The Genestealer is one of the most insidious bioforms in the Tyranid arsenal. Unlike the brute force organisms that make up the bulk of a Tyranid swarm, the Genestealer is designed for subtlety, for patience, for the long game. It is the scalpel to the swarm's sledgehammer, and it may be the single most effective weapon the hive mind has ever devised. The process begins when a single Genestealer reaches an inhabited world. It might arrive aboard a derelict space hulk, hidden among the wreckage of a destroyed ship, or it might be deliberately deployed by a hive fleet as a vanguard organism. However it arrives, the Genestealer's first priority is to find a suitable host, a sentient being, usually a human, though other species can be targeted as well. The Genestealer subdues its victim through a combination of physical force and a powerful hypnotic ability that leaves the victim docile and compliant. Then it performs what is euphemistically called the Genestealer's kiss, a process by which it implants its own genetic material into the host. The infected host does not die. In fact, they appear to be perfectly normal, at least outwardly. They return to their lives, their jobs, their families, but something fundamental has changed. Their genetic code has been altered, rewritten at the deepest level to incorporate Tyranid DNA. And when they eventually reproduce, their children will not be entirely human. The first generation of hybrid offspring bears obvious signs of Genestealer heritage: extra limbs, elongated skulls, sharp claws, features that would immediately mark them as alien in any normal society. Oh, but here is the fiendish brilliance of the Genestealer's design. These first-generation hybrids possess the same hypnotic ability as their Genestealer ancestor, and they use it to conceal themselves and their monstrous appearance from the wider population. To anyone under their psychic influence, they look perfectly normal. The second and third generations of hybrids are less obviously alien, but still distinctly abnormal. They might be larger than average, or have subtle differences in their facial structure, or possess an unusual pallor. They are still recognizable as something other than fully human to anyone who looks closely enough. But by this point, the cult has grown. The original Genestealer, now grown into a massive patriarch, has infected dozens of hosts, each of whom has produced hybrid offspring, and each of whom has infected more hosts in turn. The cult numbers in the hundreds, then the thousands, then the tens of thousands. They have infiltrated every level of society, from the lowest laborers to the highest-ranking government officials. They have their own religion, a twisted faith that worships the patriarch as a divine being and anticipates the coming of star gods who will descend from the heavens to reward the faithful. By the fourth generation, the hybrids are almost indistinguishable from normal humans. They can walk freely through any city, hold any job, rise to any rank in the planetary government or military hierarchy. They are the cult's public face, the ones who recruit new members, who spread the cult's influence into new areas, who position themselves in positions of power and authority where they can do the most damage when the time comes. And the fifth generation, the final step in the cycle, produces pure Genestealers, starting the cycle all over again. A fully mature Genestealer cult can number in the billions. It can span multiple continents, multiple hive cities, even multiple worlds. Its members hold positions at every level of society, from the factory floor to the governor's palace. They control local militia units, they have agents in the planetary defense forces, they have access to military hardware and fortified positions, and they are fanatically unshakably devoted to the cult and its patriarch. They believe with every fiber of their being that they are the chosen ones, that the star gods are coming to reward them for their faith, or that the day of ascension is at hand. The tragic irony, of course, is that they are partially correct. Something is indeed coming, but it is not coming to reward them. It is coming to devour them, along with everything else on the planet. The star gods they have been praying to are the Tyranid Hive Fleet, drawn to the world by the psychic beacon of the patriarch's brood mind. And when the fleet arrives, when the sky darkens with Tyranid spore pods and the ground trembles under the weight of millions of chitinous feet, the cult members will learn, in the final moments of their lives, that their devotion was rewarded not with ascension, but with annihilation. They will be consumed by the very beings they worshipped, their biomass broken down and incorporated into the swarm alongside everyone else on the planet. Some will be horrified. Some will go willingly, seeing even their own consumption as a form of religious ecstasy, but the end result is the same for all of them. The Genestealer cult is the ultimate fifth column, a planetary-scale sabotage operation that can take generations to mature, but is devastatingly effective when it finally activates. When a hive fleet approaches a world with a mature Genestealer cult, the cult rises up in coordinated rebellion. Suddenly, the planetary defense forces are fighting a civil war at the exact moment they need to be preparing for an alien invasion. Fortifications are sabotaged from within, communication networks are disrupted, military stockpiles are destroyed or seized. The planet's ability to mount a coherent defense is shattered before the first Tyranid organism even makes landfall. And the Genestealer infestation is not limited to a handful of worlds. It is spread across the entire galaxy, seeded on thousands upon thousands of Imperial worlds by Genestealers that have traveled from system to system aboard merchant ships, military transports, and derelict space hulks. The Imperium has no idea how deeply the infestation has spread. It could be on your world right now, a cult growing in the shadows beneath your feet, waiting for the day when the sky goes dark and the stars begin to move.
Look, I just want to take a quick second here to say something personal. Out of every faction I have covered on this channel, the Tyranids are the ones that genuinely unsettle me. Not because of the grimdark violence or the body horror. Plenty of factions have that. It is because of the silence. Every other villain in this setting has a voice. Chaos screams at you, orcs laugh at you, the Necrons monologue at you. The Tyranids just arrive and start eating, and they don't care that you exist. There's something about that indifference that hits different when you really sit with it. You're not even an enemy to them, you are lunch. And I think that is why they stick with people long after they put the bug down or finish the game. But anyway, that was just my take, and let's go back to the video.
Now that we have established what the Tyranids are, how they function, and how they prepare the ground for their invasions, let us turn our attention to the battles themselves. Let us trace the history of the Tyrannic Wars, from the first terrible encounter at the Battle of Macragge to the present day, where the Fourth Tyrannic War rages across the Segmentum Pacificus and the shadow of the hive mind falls ever closer to holy terror itself. The story of the Tyrannic Wars is, in many ways, the story of the galaxy learning to fear. Each successive war has been worse than the last, each hive fleet larger and more sophisticated than its predecessor, each conflict teaching the defenders of the galaxy a new lesson about the depths of the Tyranid threat. And the overarching narrative, the thread that connects all four wars, is one of slow, creeping realization. The understanding, grudging, and terrified that the Tyranids may not be something that can be beaten at all. The First Tyrannic War began, as we have already discussed, with the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth in the Eastern Fringe. This was the first major Hive fleet to enter the Milky Way, and its approach was about as subtle as a freight train barreling through a living room. Behemoth did not probe, did not feint, did not employ sophisticated strategic maneuvers. It simply ploughed forward in a straight line, consuming everything in its path with an almost mindless fury that spoke of a hunger so vast, so primal, that strategy was an afterthought to the sheer biological imperative of feeding. The first worlds to fall were the small, isolated outposts on the eastern fringe, places so remote that their loss went unnoticed by the wider Imperium for months. Tyran Primus, where the Adeptus Mechanicus research station was overrun and where the species would earn its name. Thandros, or the communications relay world that was silenced so quickly that its final transmissions were little more than screams and static. These were the preliminary courses in a feast of planetary annihilation, appetizers before the main course that was to follow. As Behemoth carved its way deeper into Imperial space, it entered the domain of Ultramar, the stellar realm of the Ultramarines chapter of Space Marines. Ultramar was no backwater collection of frontier worlds. It was one of the most well-defended and efficiently administered regions in all of Imperial space, a network of prosperous planets overseen by the Ultramarines, and governed with a competence that was the envy of the wider Imperium. If any region in the galaxy was prepared to face an alien invasion of unprecedented scale, it was Ultramar, and yet it nearly was not enough. The first major world in Ultramar to feel the teeth of Behemoth was Prandium, known as the jewel in Ultramar's crown. It was an agri-world of stunning beauty, a paradise of lush forests and teeming oceans that supplied food to the surrounding systems. The Tyranids fell upon Prandium with a ferocity that defied comprehension. The world's defenders, a combination of Ultramarines forces and local planetary defense forces, fought with everything they had, but they were simply overwhelmed. The numbers were too great, the assault too relentless. Within days, Prandium was dead, stripped of every living thing, down to the smallest bacterium. Even the atmosphere was partially consumed, the very air drained of its oxygen content by Tyranid organisms designed to break down gaseous compounds into usable biomass. What was left was a barren, sheer lifeless husk, a ball of dead rock floating in the void, where a paradise had once been. The loss of Prandium was a body blow to the Ultramarines, not just militarily, but psychologically. This was not some distant, insignificant frontier world. This was Prandium, one of the crown jewels of Ultramar. If the Tyranids could do this to Prandium, they could do it to any world, including Macragge. Chapter Master Marnios Calgar understood this with the clarity of a general who has just seen the enemy's true strength for the first time. He knew that Macragge was next in Behemoth's path, and he knew that if Macragge fell, the entire Ultramar subsector would follow. More than that, the fall of the Ultramarines' homeworld would be a devastating blow to the morale of the entire Imperium. The Ultramarines were the most respected, our most honored chapter in all of the Adeptus Astartes. Their homeworld was a symbol of imperial might and resilience. Losing it to an alien swarm would send shockwaves through the entire Imperium of man. So Calgar made a decision that would define his legacy and the legacy of his chapter for centuries to come. He declared that the Hive fleet would be halted at Macragge, not slowed, not diverted, halted. Period. The full might of the Ultramarines chapter, supported by the Ultramar defense fleet and every available Imperial Navy asset, would be thrown against Hive Fleet Behemoth in a do-or-die battle for the survival of Ultramar and, by extension, the galaxy. The preparations for the defense of Macragge were extensive and thorough. The planet's already formidable defenses were reinforced. Star Nova-class orbital weapon stations were positioned in orbit, their massive batteries aimed at the void. Dozens of warships were assembled into a battle fleet, from the Ultramarines' mighty battle barges to heavy cruisers of the Ultramar defense fleet, to a ragtag collection of armed merchant vessels and privateers. Every space-worthy vessel in the system that could mount a weapon was pressed into service. On the ground, the planet's twin polar fortresses, already among the strongest defensive positions in Imperial space, were further fortified and garrisoned with the best troops available. Inquisitor Kripman, who had been the first to identify the Tyranid threat, arrived at Macragge ahead of the Hive fleet and briefed Calgar on everything the Imperium knew about the Tyranids. It was not much, but it was enough to give the defenders a fighting chance. Kripman had identified a potential weakness in the Tyranid fleet's command structure. The destruction of the largest bioships seemed to cause temporary confusion among the surrounding organisms. A brief window of discoordination before the hive mind could reassert its control through other synapse nodes. It was a small advantage, but in a battle of this magnitude, small advantages could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The battle began in space as the outrider vessels of the Tyranid fleet entered the Macragge system. The initial contact was violent and costly for both sides. Wave after wave of Tyranid bioships hurled themselves at the Imperial defensive line, and wave after wave was torn apart by the massed firepower of the orbital stations and warships. But with each wave, a few more spore pods slipped through the defenses and plummeted toward the planet's surface. And with each wave, the defenders lost more ships, more stations, more irreplaceable assets that could not be replaced in the time frame they had available. The space battle was a slow-motion catastrophe. The first assault wave claimed the mighty battle barge Caesar. The third wave saw the destruction of much of Ultramar's merchant fleet as Tyranid void organisms punched through the perimeter breach. By the ninth wave, Macragge's orbital stations had been reduced to debris. By the 12th, the orbital defenses were effectively destroyed. Macragge lay open to the sky, and the Tyranids poured down upon it like rain. On the ground, the fighting was even more desperate. The Tyranids made landfall in the polar regions, launching their assault directly at the planet's fortified positions. The defenders held, barely, sustained by the discipline that made the Ultramarines the exemplars of their kind, and the fortifications that had been reinforced to withstand exactly this kind of assault. But the Tyranids kept coming, an endless tide of chitinous bodies pouring against the walls of the polar fortresses like a living ocean. It was here, at the Battle of Cold Steel Ridge, that the Swarmlord made its first documented appearance against the Imperium. This unique bioform, the pinnacle of the hive mind's tactical genius, was deployed specifically to counter Calgar's strategies, and it did so with devastating effect. Every tactic Calgar employed, the Swarmlord had an answer for. Every defensive position the Ultramarines established, first the Swarmlord found a way to outflank or overwhelm. Calgar himself confronted the Swarmlord in personal combat and was nearly killed, saved only by the heroic sacrifice of his entire honor guard, who threw themselves between their chapter master and the Tyranid monster. The commander of the guard, a veteran named Aloysius, who had served Calgar for decades, died buying his master those precious few seconds to escape. While Calgar battled on the surface, the war in space reached its climax. The Ultramarines' fleet, battered and bleeding, pursued the Tyranid fleet to the ringed world of Circe at the edge of the system. There, the Tyranids sprung their own trap, revealing a second fleet that had been concealed among the planet's rings. But Calgar had laid plans of his own. The arrival of Battlefleet Tempestus, over 200 warships strong, Calgar caught the Tyranid fleet in a crushing pincer. Even so, the Tyranids had superiority in numbers, and the battle hung in the balance until the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra, crippled and dying, charged into the heart of the Hive fleet and detonated its warp drives. The resulting warp vortex sucked the Dominus Astra and the entire Tyranid fleet into oblivion, ending the space battle in a single cataclysmic instant. But the war on the ground was not yet won. At the northern polar fortress, Captain Saul Invictus of the Ultramarines' First Company, the chapter's elite Terminators, held the walls against the full fury of the Tyranid assault. The fighting was the most intense that any living space marine had ever experienced, a non-stop onslaught of chitin and chlorin acid that tested the limits of even post-human endurance. When the Third Company finally fought their way through to relieve the First Company, they found the fortress's lower levels carpeted with Tyranid bodies stacked 6 deep around the doors. Within the final room, a circle of Terminators lay where they had fought, back to back, surrounded by the corpses of the creatures they had killed. The entire First Company, every single veteran Terminator, had been killed. They had held the fortress. They had bought the time needed for the fleet to win the space battle, but they had paid for that time with their lives. The Battle of Macragge was a victory for the Imperium, but it was a victory that tasted of ash and blood. The Ultramarines had been mauled, their First Company completely destroyed, their fleet badly damaged, their homeworld scarred. The losses would take over a century to replace. Chaplain Orten Cassius, who had survived the battle, was so marked by the experience that he devoted the rest of his considerable lifespan to the study and destruction of the Tyranid species, creating the Tyrannic War Veterans, a specialized unit of Marines trained specifically to fight the Great Devourer. But the battle also provided the Imperium with its first real data on how to fight the Tyranids. It proved that the Hive fleets could be defeated, that the bioships could be destroyed, that the swarms could be broken if enough firepower was applied at the right places. It was a Pyrrhic victory, yes, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for a galaxy that had been looking into the face of extinction, any victory, no matter how costly, was a reason to keep fighting. After the destruction of Behemoth's main body at Macragge, one of the surviving splinter fleets scattered in all directions, fragments of the Hive fleet that would continue to plague Imperial space for decades to come. One such splinter, led by a particularly large and vicious Carnifex that would later be known as Old One-Eye, attacked the neighboring world of Calth. Though this attack was eventually repelled, Old One-Eye itself proved incredibly difficult to kill, disappearing into the wilderness and resurfacing years later to terrorize the defenders all over again. It was a grim reminder that even a defeated Hive fleet could leave behind deadly remnants. The Imperium, in its characteristic combination of arrogance and bureaucratic inertia, allowed itself to believe that the worst was over. Behemoth had been destroyed. The Tyranids had been beaten. Yes, there were scattered remnants to clean up. But the existential threat had been dealt with. An armed presence was maintained in the eastern fringe. But over the following 2.5 centuries, the Administratum began to question the need for such costly vigilance. Surely, some bureaucrats argued, Behemoth had been the sum total of the Tyranid race. Surely there would be no more Hive fleets. They could not have been more wrong. 250 years after the Battle of Macragge, the galaxy was about to learn that Behemoth was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The beginning of a war that would make the Battle of Macragge look like a minor border skirmish. Because the next Hive fleet was coming, and this one was not going to make the same mistakes as its predecessor. When worlds along the eastern fringe began erupting in rebellion and civil unrest, the Administratum dismissed it as a routine disturbance. Rebellion was nothing new in the Imperium. Discontent was practically a fact of life in a civilization that ground its citizens beneath the boot of endless warfare and oppressive theocracy. But the Inquisition, ever paranoid, ever watchful, was not so easily satisfied. Something about these rebellions felt wrong. They were too widespread, too coordinated, too perfectly timed. When inquisitorial investigators dug deeper, they found something chilling. Many of the dissenting bureaucrats who had been downplaying the situation had either come from the southeastern region of the galaxy or had traveled there at some point. The Inquisition began to suspect that these adepts were not simply mistaken. They were compromised. The truth, when it emerged, was worse than anyone had feared. Yes, the rebellions were not spontaneous uprisings. They were genestealer insurrections, the activation of cults that had been growing in the shadows for generations. And they were heralding the arrival of something massive, something that dwarfed Behemoth in both scale and sophistication. Hive Fleet Kraken had arrived. Where Behemoth had been a blunt instrument, a single massive thrust straight toward the heart of Ultramar, Kraken was a many-headed serpent. Instead of concentrating its forces into a single, overwhelming assault, Kraken split itself into numerous smaller tendrils, each one striking at a different target simultaneously. This dispersed approach was a nightmare for Imperial defenders, because it meant that there was no single point of contact to focus on, no single battle line to hold. Our worlds were being attacked across a front that spanned thousands of light years, and the defenders simply did not have the resources to be everywhere at once. The first worlds to fall to Kraken were consumed with terrifying speed. Sotha, the homeworld of the Scythes of the Emperor Space Marine chapter, was overrun and destroyed. The chapter itself was nearly annihilated, reduced to a handful of survivors who would spend decades trying to rebuild. Miral, Graia, Radna, all of them consumed in quick succession, their populations devoured, their biomass incorporated into the ever-growing swarm. But Kraken's most devastating attacks were yet to come, and they struck at two targets simultaneously, targets that, had they fallen, would have changed the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The first target was the Imperial hive world of Ishar 4. The second was the Aeldari craft world of Iyandan. On Ishar 4, the Tyranid assault was preceded by the activation of a massive genestealer cult that had been growing beneath the planet's hive cities for generations. The cult rose up in a coordinated rebellion, seizing key infrastructure, assassinating military commanders, and throwing the planet's defenses into chaos at the exact moment the Tyranid bioships appeared in orbit. It was a perfect demonstration of the genestealer cult strategy in action. Decades of patient infiltration, culminating in a single devastating stroke that left the defenders reeling before the main assault even began. But the Imperium was not without its champions. Marnius Kalga, the chapter master of the Ultramarines, Percy had learned much from his experiences at Macragge 2.5 centuries earlier. He recognized the Tyranid threat immediately and took personal command of the defense of Ishar 4, bringing with him the hard-won lessons of the First Tyrannic War. Using tactics he had developed specifically for fighting the Tyranids, emphasizing concentrated firepower on synapse creatures, rapid response to breaches in the defensive line, and the coordinated use of orbital assets, Kalga rallied the defenders and turned what had seemed like an inevitable defeat into a fighting chance. The Battle of Ishar 4 was a brutal, grinding affair that lasted for weeks. The Tyranids threw everything they had at the defenders, from the smallest gaunt to the largest biotitan. Kalga himself faced the Swarmlord once again, and this time, as having learned from their previous encounter, it was Kalga who emerged triumphant, slaying the beast in an epic duel that became one of the most celebrated single combats in Ultramarines history. Without the Swarmlord to coordinate the attack, the Tyranid assault faltered, and the defenders were able to push them back and eventually drive them from the planet. But victory came at a terrible cost. Ishar 4 was left in ruins, its hive cities shattered, its population decimated, and the Space Marine chapters that had fought alongside the Ultramarines had suffered grievous losses. The Scythes of the Emperor, already reeling from the loss of their homeworld, were reduced to a bare handful of surviving Marines. The Lamenters, a chapter already cursed with seemingly unending bad luck, were all but wiped out. These were chapters that would take centuries to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Aeldari craft world of Iyandan was fighting for its very existence. Iyandan was one of the largest and most populous craft worlds, a massive starfaring vessel that was home to millions of Eldari souls. It was also one of the most beautiful, a living work of art that represented thousands of years of Eldari culture and craftsmanship. When Hive Fleet Kraken turned its gaze upon Iyandan, it set in motion one of the most tragic chapters in the already tragic history of the Eldari race. The Eldari are a psychic species, and the approach of the Tyranid fleet was felt long before it was seen. The shadow in the warp descended upon Iyandan like a funeral shroud, muffling the psychic senses that the Eldari relied upon for everything from communication to combat. Farseer Kelman, the political and spiritual leader of the craft world, called together the entire population of Iyandan in the place of answering, a great hall capable of holding every Eldari on the craft world, and warned them of what was coming. The debate that followed was heated and prolonged, with some advocating for flight and others arguing for a stand. In the end, They chose to fight. They had no other real option. Iyanden was their home, and there was nowhere to run that the Tyranids could not follow. The battle that followed was among the most devastating in Aeldari history. The Tyranids boarded the craft world directly, pouring through breaches in its hull and flooding its corridors with a tide of chitinous bodies. When the Aeldari fought with the desperate courage of those who know they are fighting for everything, but the sheer numbers of the swarm threatened to overwhelm them. Room by room, corridor by corridor, the defenders were pushed back. It seemed as though Iyanden was doomed. Salvation came from an unexpected quarter. Prince Iriel, an exiled Aeldari corsair who had once been Iyanden's greatest admiral before being banished for his arrogance, returned at the head of his corsair fleet. Iriel had heard of the Craftworld's plight and had put aside his exile and his pride to come to the aid of his people. His fleet struck the Tyranid bioships from behind, breaking their hold on Iyanden and allowing the defenders to regroup. Then Iriel himself, wielding the Spear of Twilight, a cursed weapon that would slowly drain his own life force with every use. Elid led a counterattack into the heart of the Tyranid swarm and killed the massive psychic organism that was directing the assault. Iyanden survived, but the cost was almost beyond bearing. 4/5 of the Craftworld's population lay dead. The great halls that had once rung with music and laughter were silent tombs. The Infinity Circuit, the psychic repository where the souls of the dead Aeldari were preserved, was swollen to bursting with the spirits of the newly fallen. Iyanden would carry the scars of the Battle of Kraken for millennia, a shattered remnant of what it had once been, haunted by the ghosts of its own dead. The combined defeats at Ikar IV and Iyanden broke the back of Hive Fleet Kraken, but they did not destroy it. Kraken splintered into numerous smaller fleets that scattered in all directions, whilst penetrating deep into Imperial space and attacking worlds far from the eastern fringe. These splinter fleets were, in some ways, more dangerous than the original Hive Fleet, because they were everywhere, unpredictable, and capable of striking at targets that thought themselves far from the Tyranid threat. Some of them would continue to plague the galaxy for decades, growing larger and more powerful as they consumed world after world. And the worst part? Kraken had taught the hive mind valuable lessons. Behemoth had been a brute force approach that had been defeated by a concentrated defense at a single choke point. Kraken's multi-pronged strategy had been more effective, overwhelming the defender's ability to respond to multiple threats simultaneously and penetrating far deeper into Imperial space before being stopped. The next Hive Fleet would incorporate both of these lessons and add new ones of its own. Less than 5 standard years after the defeat of Kraken, Inquisitor Cryptman, the same man who had first identified the Tyranid threat decades earlier, noticed the signs of yet another approaching Hive Fleet. But this one was different. This one was coming from a direction that no one had anticipated. Not from the eastern fringe where the previous 2 Hive Fleets had entered the galaxy, but from below the galactic plane. It was rising up through the underbelly of the galaxy, attacking from a vector that the Imperium's defenses were completely unprepared for. Hive Fleet Leviathan had arrived, and it was the largest Tyranid incursion the galaxy had ever seen. Cryptman implemented what became known as the Cryptman Census. It's a massive astro-telepathic survey that burned out dozens of astropaths in the effort to contact every documented planet on the southern fringe of the Imperium. The worlds that failed to respond began to form a pattern, a shape that Cryptman recognized with growing horror. The outline of 2 massive tendrils, spaced hundreds of light years apart, closing like the jaws of some impossibly vast predator. The shadow in the warp that Leviathan cast between these 2 tendrils was so intense that it isolated entire sectors of space, cutting off hundreds of worlds from the rest of the Imperium in a single stroke. Leviathan's strategy was the most sophisticated the hive mind had ever employed. The 2-tendril approach created a vast area of warp shadow between them, trapping Imperial worlds in a pocket of psychic silence where they could neither call for help nor receive reinforcements. The tendrils advanced in parallel, consuming the worlds in the shadow zone from both sides simultaneously. It was like watching a pair of jaws slowly closing, grinding everything between them to dust. Cryptman, recognizing that the Imperium did not have the resources to fight Leviathan on a conventional front, made a series of decisions that were as brilliant as they were controversial. First, he ordered the exterminators of multiple worlds directly in the path of the advancing tendrils, destroying habitable planets to deny the Tyranids the biomass they needed to sustain their advance. This slowed the fleet, but at a cost that the wider Imperium found unconscionable. But worlds that had been home to millions of loyal Imperial citizens were reduced to ashes by the order of a single Inquisitor. The Inquisition itself eventually censured Cryptman for his actions, stripping him of much of his authority, though many of those who criticized him privately acknowledged that he had probably saved far more worlds than he had destroyed. But Cryptman's most audacious gambit was yet to come. Recognizing that the Imperium could not defeat Leviathan by force alone, he hatched a plan so extreme, so risky, that it bordered on insanity. He captured a brood of Genestealers and released them into the Orc Empire of Octarius, a densely populated region of Orc-controlled space that teemed with biological life. The Genestealers did what Genestealers do. They infiltrated, they infected, and they called. And the call was answered. What a massive tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan diverted from its course and plunged into the Octarius system, drawn by the psychic beacon of the Genestealer brood. The result was the Octarius War, one of the most bizarre and terrifying conflicts in the galaxy's history. Tyranids versus orcs, in a war of attrition that had no end in sight. The orcs, being orcs, relished the fight, growing larger and more aggressive with each battle. The Tyranids, being Tyranids, adapted to the orcs' tactics and grew more efficient at countering them with each engagement. Both species fed off the conflict, the orcs growing stronger through their innate love of combat, and the Tyranids growing more powerful by consuming the vast amounts of orc biomass. It was an escalating arms race between two of the most dangerous species in the galaxy.
Yes, and no one knew which side would eventually prevail. The Octarius War did accomplish its primary objective. It diverted a huge portion of Leviathan's forces away from Imperial space. But it also created a new problem, a potentially even worse one. Whoever won the Octarius War, whether it was the orcs or the Tyranids, would emerge from the conflict as an even greater threat than they had been before. Orcs battle-hardened by years of fighting Tyranids, or Tyranids bloated with the biomass of an entire orc empire. Either outcome was a nightmare scenario for the rest of the galaxy. While the Octarius War raged, the remainder of Hive Fleet Leviathan continued its advance into Imperial space, and one of its largest tendrils set course for a target that would become one of the most famous battlegrounds in the history of the Imperium, Baal, and the homeworld of the Blood Angels Space Marine chapter. The devastation of Baal, as it came to be known, was one of the most apocalyptic battles in the history of the Imperium. Commander Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, and the oldest living space marine in the Imperium, recognized the scale of the threat and took unprecedented steps to prepare. He sent out a call to every Blood Angel's successor, every chapter that carried the gene seed of the Primarch Sanguinius, summoning them to Baal for what might be the final stand of the Sons of Sanguinius. It was the largest gathering of the Blood Angels' lineage since the days of the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years earlier. When the Tyranids arrived, the scale of the fleet was almost incomprehensible. Over 50,000 bioships descended upon the Baal system, as a living armada so vast that it blotted out the stars themselves. The Blood Angels' fleet, though mighty by any normal standard, was hopelessly outnumbered. The naval engagement above Baal was a slow-motion catastrophe, the Blood Angels' ships fighting with the desperate courage of those who know they are the last line of defense, but being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. On the surface of Baal, the battle was even more desperate. Tyranid organisms made landfall in staggering numbers, pouring down from the sky in an endless rain of spore pods and tyrannocyte assault organisms. The defenders constructed elaborate defensive lines, including moats filled with the toxic substance known as thirst water, automated gun batteries, and the ancient fortifications of the Blood Angels' fortress monastery, the Arx Angelicum. For a time they held. The first 19 waves of the Tyranid assault were repelled, each one larger than the last, each one pushing the defenders closer to the breaking point. 5 chapter masters fell in those initial engagements, their gene seed recovered at the cost of still more lives. But the Tyranids adapted, as they always do. They filled the thirst water moats with their own bodies, creating living bridges for the larger bioforms to cross. They attacked the void shield generators that protected the Arx Angelicum, and the Swarm Lord itself was deployed to the surface, leading the assault with a tactical brilliance that countered every move the defenders made. Commander Dante confronted the Swarm Lord in single combat, and after a brutal fight that pushed both warriors to their absolute limits, Dante managed to slay the beast. But he was badly wounded in the process, and the Tyranid assault continued unabated. Just when it seemed that all was lost, when the defenders had been pushed back to the walls of the Arx Angelicum, and the sky was dark with falling spore pods, salvation came from the most unexpected of sources. The Great Rift, that galaxy-splitting wound in reality caused by the fall of Cadia and the 13th Black Crusade, tore open across the Baal system. The warp storms that followed disrupted the Tyranid fleet, cutting off reinforcements and throwing the bioships into disarray. And from the warp came demons, legions of cornate blood demons, led by the bloodthirster Kabanda, the ancient nemesis of the Blood Angels who had fought them since the days of Sanguinius himself. Kabanda declared that no one would have the right to destroy the Blood Angels but him, and his demon legions threw themselves at the Tyranids with a fury that matched even the hunger of the Great Devourer. The demons did not save Baal out of any altruism or sense of mercy. Kabanda's motivations were purely selfish, a petty jealousy that refused to allow anyone else to claim the kill. But the result was the same. The Tyranid assault was thrown into chaos, caught between the defenders on the ground and the demons descending from the warp. And then, when even this might not have been enough, the fleet of the Indomitus Crusade arrived, led by none other than the resurrected Primarch Rabute Guilliman himself. Guilliman's forces, including newly created Primaris Space Marines, slammed into the remaining Tyranids with overwhelming force, and after weeks of additional fighting, Baal was declared saved. But saved was a generous description of what remained. Baal and its moons were devastated. Most of the Blood Angels' successor chapters had been mauled beyond recognition. The fortress monastery was in ruins. The world itself would require decades of reconstruction before it could be considered inhabitable again. On the barren surface of Baal Prime, the demons had left behind a grim monument, a mountain of Tyranid skulls arranged in the 8-pillared symbol of Horn,
a reminder that Baal had been saved not by faith or heroism, but by the petty jealousy of a demon prince. In the aftermath of the devastation of Baal, Gilliman named Commander Dante as the Lord Regent of the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy cut off from terror by the Great Rift. It was a testament to Dante's skill and his chapter's sacrifice, but it was also a recognition of the grim reality that the Tyranid threat was far from over. And indeed, the hive mind was already adapting, already planning its next move, already directing its tendrils toward a new target, one that would bring the Tyranid threat closer to the heart of the Imperium than anyone had ever thought possible. The Fourth Tyrannic War began in the era Indomitus, and it is the conflict that currently rages across the galaxy as we speak. It began, as all Tyranid invasions do, with silence. Deep space satellite servers in the Segmentum Pacificus, the region of imperial space that lies to the galactic west of Terra, began going dark. Astromagnetic beacons that had transmitted data for centuries suddenly stopped working. Worlds that had been in regular contact with Sector Command went silent, one after another, like candles being snuffed out by an invisible hand. At first, no one paid much attention. The Segmentum Pacificus was a vast and troubled region of space, plagued by warp storms and orc raids and the lingering effects of the Great Rift. A few lost worlds here and there was nothing unusual, but as the silence spread, as more and more worlds fell out of contact, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. The lost worlds formed a shape, a familiar, terrifying shape, the outline of two massive tendrils, converging from above and below the galactic plane, moving in parallel toward a single, unmistakable destination. Segmentum Solar, Holy Terra, the heart of the Imperium of Man. Hive Fleet Leviathan had returned, not as a remnant, and not as a collection of splinter fleets, but as the largest invasion force the Tyranid species had ever directed at a single region of space. And this time, it was not attacking from the distant eastern fringe, where the Imperium had learned to expect Tyranid incursions. It was attacking from the galactic west, from a direction that the Imperium's defenses had never been designed to cover, through a region of space that was already weakened by the depredations of Chaos forces and the disruption of the Great Rift. The two main tendrils of the invasion were designated Hive Fleet Nautilon and Hive Fleet Promethor by Imperial historians. A third, designated Hive Fleet Grendulus, targeted the Bastior subsector, a crucial region that contained key warp routes connecting the Segmentum Pacificus to the rest of the Imperium. If the Bastior subsector fell, the entire western arm of the galaxy would be cut off, isolated and defenseless against the advancing swarm. The Imperium's response was hampered by the simple fact that most of its military resources were committed elsewhere. The Indomitus Crusade, Gilliman's massive campaign to reunite and reinforce the shattered Imperium, had drawn the bulk of the Imperium's military might to the galactic east, where it was fighting Chaos forces, orc invasions, and 100 other threats. The Segmentum Pacificus was, in strategic terms, the back door of the Imperium, and it had been left relatively unguarded. But the Imperium was not completely helpless. Captain General Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes and Lord Commander Solar Arcadian Leontus coordinated a massive mobilization effort. It's marshalling every available resource to meet the Tyranid advance. A policy of aggressive defense was formulated, and elite rapid response strike forces called Soul Blades were established to disrupt the Tyranid advance. These Soul Blades, consisting of Space Marines, Sisters of Battle, Militarum Tempestus stormtroopers, Knight households, Mechanicum forces, and even Custodes, were given broad strategic autonomy and tasked with striking at the Tyranids wherever they could, slowing the advance and buying time for larger forces to be mobilized. The early battles of the Fourth Tyrannic War were desperate affairs. Ogram, an imperial hive world, was one of the first to fall, its population consumed by the swarm despite a valiant defense. The world's fate was decided by a global campaign in which players around the world fought battles to determine whether the planet would survive or fall. The Tyranids won, and Ogram was stripped bare, added to the growing tally of dead worlds in the Leviathan's wake. As I speak these words, the Fourth Tyrannic War continues. The tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan continue their advance towards Segmentum Solar. The Soul Blades fight a running battle across the Bastior subsector and beyond, winning small victories here and there, but unable to halt the overall advance. And somewhere out there, in the cold void between galaxies, the main body of the Tyranid swarm continues its slow, relentless approach, drawn by a light that has been shining for 10,000 years. At a light that was meant to guide humanity's ships through the darkness, but has instead called the galaxy's greatest predator to its door. Before we address the central question of this discussion, let us spend some time examining something that often gets overlooked when people talk about the Tyranid menace: the actual process by which the Tyranids consume a world. Because it is not the frenzied, chaotic free-for-all that many people imagine. It is in fact one of the most methodical, efficient, and deeply horrifying processes in the entire setting. Understanding it gives us a window into the alien intelligence of the hive mind that no amount of battlefield analysis can provide. The consumption of a world by the Tyranids follows a series of distinct phases, each one more terrible than the last. And each one executed with a precision that would make the most meticulous Imperial logistics officer weep with envy. It is a process that has been refined over millions of years and untold numbers of consumed worlds, honed to a level of efficiency that wastes not a single molecule of useful material. There is a cold, mechanical beauty to it, if you can stomach the horror long enough to appreciate the engineering. The first phase, long before the hive fleet itself arrives, is the infiltration phase. This is where the genestealers and other vanguard organisms do their work. Lictors, those terrifying stealth predators with their chameleonic scales and their ability to move through even the most inhospitable terrain undetected, are often among the first Tyranid organisms to reach a target world. They are not there to fight. They are there to observe, to catalogue, to map the planet's defenses, identify its weak points, and assess the quality and quantity of its biomass. The information they gather is transmitted back to the hive fleet through their psychic link to the hive mind, allowing the fleet to plan its assault with full knowledge of what it will face. A lictor is a remarkable organism in its own right, and one that deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions about the Tyranid threat. Standing roughly 3 meters tall when fully upright, though it rarely assumes that posture, the lictor is covered in chameleonic scales that can shift color and texture to match its surroundings with near-perfect fidelity. It can remain motionless for days, weeks, even months, while waiting with a patience that no human scout could match for the perfect moment to observe or strike. Its feeder tendrils, long whip-like appendages that extend from its maw, can taste the very air itself, detecting chemical compounds at concentrations measured in parts per billion. It can track a single human through a crowded hive city by the unique chemical signature of their sweat. And it is smart, far smarter than the basic Tyranid bioforms, capable of independent action and complex problem-solving that suggests a level of cunning that borders on true intelligence. But the lictor's most important function is not assassination, though it excels at that as well. Its most important function is transmission. Every piece of data the lictor gathers, every defensive position it maps, every patrol route it observes, every weapon emplacement it catalogues, is transmitted back to the hive mind through the synaptic network. By the time the hive fleet arrives, it has a comprehensive understanding of the planet's defenses, its population distribution, its industrial capacity, and its biological diversity. The invasion that follows is not a blind, groping attack into the unknown. It is a precisely targeted assault, informed by months or years of reconnaissance, directed at the specific weak points that the lictors have identified. Meanwhile, the genestealers have been doing their slower, more insidious work for generations. The cults they have established are reaching maturity, their tendrils of influence extending into every level of society. Planetary governors, military commanders, factory foremen, port authorities, all of them potentially compromised. Or all of them ready to serve the will of the patriarch when the signal comes. The planet does not know it, but it is already half conquered before the first hive ship even appears on the edge of the system. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a world, a busy, thriving imperial hive world with billions of inhabitants. It has factories that produce ammunition and vehicles for the Imperial Guard. It has a garrison of planetary defense forces, well-trained and well-equipped. It has void shields and orbital defense platforms and all the other trappings of a world that takes its defense seriously. On the surface, it appears to be a model of Imperial preparedness, a hard target that any invading force would think twice about attacking. But beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, the rot has already set in. The foreman of the main ammunition factory is a fourth-generation hybrid who looks perfectly human, but whose loyalty belongs entirely to the patriarch slumbering in the underhive. The commander of the 3rd Planetary Defense Regiment is the grandson of a woman who received the genestealer's kiss 40 years ago, and he has been subtly positioning loyal cult members in key positions throughout his command structure. The technician who maintains the primary communications array is a cultist who has spent 3 years mapping every vulnerability in the system, ready to disable it at a moment's notice. The governor's personal physician is a magus, a psychically gifted cult leader whose hypnotic abilities have given him unrestricted access to the governor's inner circle. When the signal comes.
But when the patriarch feels the first stirrings of the hive fleet's approach through its psychic link to the hive mind, all of these carefully placed agents will activate simultaneously. The ammunition factory will explode. The 3rd Regiment will turn on its fellow defenders. The communications array will go dark. The governor will find himself surrounded by people he trusted, people he thought were his loyal servants, as they reveal their true nature and their true allegiance. The planet's defenses will not be breached from without. They will be dismantled from within, piece by people who have been planning this moment for their entire lives. That is the true genius of the genestealer cult strategy. It does not just weaken a planet's defenses, it turns those defenses against the planet itself.
Every soldier who is secretly a cultist is a soldier who will fight for the Tyranids rather than against them. Every weapon that has been sabotaged is a weapon that will not fire when the swarm arrives. Every communication link that has been compromised is a link that will carry disinformation rather than orders. The cult does not merely open the door for the Tyranid invasion, It hands the keys to the invaders and then helps them tear down the walls. The second phase begins with the arrival of the hive fleet itself. The first sign that most worlds have of the approaching swarm is the shadow in the warp. Astropaths collapse, screaming, as the psychic cacophony of the hive mind's presence crashes against their minds like a wave breaking against a cliff. Navigators report that the warp has become unnavigable, a churning soup of psychic static that makes faster-than-light travel impossible. Communications with the rest of the Imperium are cut off, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone has pulled a plug on the planet's connection to the outside universe. The world is isolated, alone, with no way to call for help and no hope of reinforcement. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Imagine being a planetary governor who has just received reports that the astropathic choir has gone silent, that the navigators are reporting impossible conditions in the warp, that contact with neighboring systems has been lost. You know what it means, or at least you suspect. You have heard the stories, read the reports from the Tyrannic Wars. You know that the shadow in the warp heralds the arrival of the Great Devourer. And you know that by the time the shadow falls, it is already too late. There will be no rescue fleet, no reinforcement convoy, no miraculous last-minute intervention by a passing Space Marine chapter. You are alone. Your world is alone. And something is coming that will consume everything you have ever built, everyone you have ever loved, every dream you have ever had for your world's future. That knowledge, that certainty of doom, is a weapon as deadly as any bioweapon in the Tyranid arsenal. Then the Genestealer cults activate. Simultaneously, across the entire planet, the cults rise up in coordinated rebellion. Bridges are blown, communications towers are destroyed, military installations are attacked from within by soldiers who were cult members all along. Power stations are sabotaged, plunging entire hive cities into darkness. While water treatment plants are poisoned, not to kill the population, but to cause enough panic and confusion to divert the attention and resources of the defenders away from the real threat. The planetary defense forces, already reeling from the loss of communication with Sector Command and the psychic disruption of the shadow in the warp, find themselves fighting a civil war at the exact moment they need to be preparing for an alien invasion. The chaos is absolute, the confusion total. The planet's ability to mount a coordinated defense is shattered in a matter of hours, and then the sky falls. The third phase is the actual invasion. The hive fleet enters orbit and begins dropping mycetic spores and tyrannocyte assault organisms onto the planet's surface. These are biological drop pods. They're living creatures that serve as transport for the ground forces. They fall from the sky in their thousands. They're tens of thousands. They're hundreds of thousands, crashing into the ground with wet organic impacts and splitting open to disgorge swarms of termagants, hormagaunts, genestealers, warriors, and every other ground-based bioform the hive mind has deemed necessary for the assault. Each spore pod bursts open like a grotesque flower, and from within its fleshy interior pours a flood of chitin armored killing machines that immediately orient on the nearest concentration of prey and begin to advance. The sky darkens with gargoyles and harpies, winged bioforms that sweep low over defensive positions and spray them with acid and bioplasma. As the ground trembles, as carnifexes and trigons and morlocks burrow or crash their way to the surface, emerging behind defensive lines and throwing the already battered defenders into complete disarray. The air fills with spores, tiny biological organisms that clog air filters, corrode metal, and begin the slow process of breaking down the planet's infrastructure at the molecular level. Breathing becomes difficult, visibility drops. The world itself seems to be changing around the defenders, becoming something alien and hostile, as if the planet is already surrendering to the inevitability of its consumption. The initial assault is designed not to conquer the planet, but to break its resistance. The hive mind is not interested in occupation. It is interested in consumption, and for that, yes, it needs the planet's defenders to be eliminated as quickly and as efficiently as possible. The swarms target military installations, population centers, and infrastructure with single-minded determination, tearing through barricades and fortifications with a relentless fury that no conventional enemy could match. The sheer density of the Tyranid assault is staggering. In some battles, the organisms are so numerous that they literally carpet the ground, a writhing, churning mass of chitin and claw that stretches from horizon to horizon, as thick as a living river and as relentless as the tide. I want you to think about what it would be like to be a soldier standing on a wall, looking out at that. Imagine the sound. Not a war cry, not the roar of engines or the boom of artillery, but a sound unlike anything you have ever heard. A chittering, clicking, scraping sound produced by millions of organisms moving in unison, their claws scratching against stone and metal and each other, their mandibles clicking open and closed in a rhythm that seems to pulse with the heartbeat of some vast, invisible intelligence. Imagine the sight, not an army arranged in formations with banners and flags and recognizable military units, but a flood. A living flood of bodies and claws and teeth that covers the ground so completely that you cannot see the earth beneath it, that piles up against the walls of your fortification like water rising against a dam, that finds every crack, every gap, every weakness in your defenses and pours through with the unstoppable force of a natural disaster. Now imagine knowing that this is just the beginning, that the creatures you are fighting now, these endless waves of gaunts and warriors and worse things, are merely the vanguard. that behind them, in orbit, are hive ships so massive they blot out the stars, and within those ships are spawning pools that can produce more organisms in a single day than your planet has bullets to fire in a year. That is what it feels like to fight the Tyranids. That is the reality that every defender of a Tyranid-targeted world must face. And it is a reality that breaks even the strongest wills. The fourth phase begins once the planet's organized resistance has been broken. This is where the true horror of the Tyranid invasion becomes apparent, because this is the phase where the Tyranids stop fighting and start eating. And eating, for the Tyranids, is not a simple process. It is an industrial operation of staggering scale and efficiency. Uncapillary towers, massive organic structures that can grow to thousands of meters in height, burst forth from the planet's crust. These towers are the Tyranid equivalent of refineries, biological processing plants that break down organic material into its component parts and channel it up to the hive ships in orbit. They grow with alarming speed, punching through buildings and roads and fortifications as if they were made of paper, their root systems spreading beneath the surface of the planet like the tendrils of some vast subterranean fungus. From their tips, great tendrils reach up into the atmosphere, connecting with the ships above and pumping a steady stream of biomass upward into the void. Yet the sight of a world in this phase of consumption is one of the most disturbing images in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, a landscape dominated by these towering organic pillars, their surfaces glistening with moisture and crawling with ripper swarms that carry chunks of biomass toward the digestion pools at their bases. At the same time, the planet's biosphere begins to break down. Spore chimneys release clouds of alien organisms into the atmosphere, microscopic creatures that begin consuming the world's plant life, breaking down forests and grasslands and ocean ecosystems into a nutritious biological slurry. Trees wither and collapse within hours of exposure, their wood and leaves dissolved by enzymes that the spores produce. Grasslands turn brown, then black, then simply cease to exist, replaced by a featureless expanse of bare, as sterile soil. The oceans change color as the microscopic organisms begin their work on the marine ecosystem, turning from blue or green to a sickly purple-brown as the water fills with dissolved organic matter and Tyranid digestive enzymes. The oceans themselves are not safe. Tyranid organisms, designed for aquatic environments, plunge into the deep, consuming everything from plankton to the largest sea creatures with equal disregard. Massive bioforms, adapted specifically for underwater warfare, hunt down the remaining marine life with the same relentless efficiency that their land-based counterparts display on the surface. The depth of the oceans is no protection either. Tyranid organisms have been observed at depths that would crush a human submarine, but they're pressure-resistant exoskeletons, allowing them to operate in environments where no other predator could follow. Within weeks, the oceans are dead, their waters reduced to a nutrient-rich broth that the capillary towers pump up to the waiting hive ships. The very soil is attacked, as burrowing organisms strip it of its organic content, leaving nothing but sterile mineral dust. These subterranean feeders are among the most thorough of all Tyranid organisms, consuming not just the obvious organic material, roots, and humus and decaying matter, but the microscopic organisms that give soil its life, the bacteria and fungi and nematodes that form the foundation of any terrestrial ecosystem. Without these organisms, the soil becomes biologically inert, incapable of supporting any form of plant life ever again. Even if the Tyranids were to somehow be driven off before completing their consumption of a world, which has happened on a handful of occasions throughout the Tyrannic Wars, the damage they leave behind is often irreversible. Worlds that have been partially consumed by the Tyranids become dead zones, barren wastelands that can never again support the levels of life they once held. The fifth and final phase is the dissolution. Once the planet's biomass has been sufficiently processed and transported to the hive ships, the Tyranid organisms themselves begin to converge on the digestion pools, massive biological vats filled with highly corrosive enzymatic fluid. And here is where the cold efficiency of the Tyranid system reaches its most disturbing expression. The organisms walk into the pools voluntarily. They do not resist. They do not try to escape. They simply march forward, one after another, and allow themselves to be dissolved, their biomass added to the final harvest. Every gaunt that fought on the planet's surface, every carnifex that smashed through its fortifications, every warrior that coordinated the assault, all of them, without exception, walk into the pools and die, their biological material reclaimed by the hive fleet for use in the next invasion. Nothing is wasted. Not a single ripper swarm, not a single spore. Everything is consumed, recycled, reclaimed. Even the atmosphere is not spared. In the final stages of dissolution, Tyranid organisms designed for atmospheric processing begin breaking down the planet's air, extracting oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide and converting them into forms that can be stored and transported by the hive ships. When the Tyranids finally depart, leaving their capillary towers to wither and crumble now that their purpose is served, the planet is left as a lifeless husk. No atmosphere, no water, no soil, nothing that could support even the most basic form of life. It is as if the world was never inhabited at all, erased so completely that even the memory of its existence will fade with time. A world that once held billions of souls, that was once home to cities and forests and oceans, is reduced to a ball of barren rock, indistinguishable from any other dead world in the galaxy. The entire process, from initial infiltration to final dissolution, can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months, depending on the size and population of the target world and the resistance offered by its defenders. But the end result is always the same: total annihilation. It is the most thorough form of destruction imaginable, more complete than even an exterminatus, which at least leaves a planet's mineral resources intact and its atmosphere in place. When the Tyranids are done with the world, there is nothing left. Nothing at all. Just cold rock and silence. Now, when we discuss the major hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, we tend to focus on the big, dramatic battles. And those battles are indeed worthy of attention, as we have discussed at length. But there is a hidden dimension to the Tyranid threat that often gets overlooked: the minor hive fleets and the strange, inexplicable behaviors that some of them have exhibited over the centuries. These lesser-known fleets are, in many ways, more revealing about the true nature of the hive mind than the major invasions, because they show us aspects of Tyranid behavior that do not fit neatly into the simple narrative of endless consumption. Consider Hive Fleet Gorgon, a relatively small hive fleet that attacked the Tau Empire. What made Gorgon remarkable was not its size, which was modest by hive fleet standards, but its extraordinary speed of adaptation. Gorgon manifested more bioform varieties than any other recorded hive fleet, and it adapted to the Tau's highly advanced weapons technology with a rapidity that alarmed even the most experienced Ordo-Xenos investigators. The Tau, who rely heavily on ranged firepower delivered by sophisticated weapon systems, found that Gorgon was producing organisms with increasingly effective resistance to their primary weapon types within the span of individual engagements. Picture the Tau commander's horror. On the first day of fighting, his pulse rifles cut through the Tyranid swarm with devastating efficiency, each shot dropping a bioform and a spray of ichor and chitin fragments. On the third day, the same weapons require 2 shots to achieve the same kill. By the 5th day, the armor plating on the Tyranid organisms has thickened so dramatically that pulse rifles are barely leaving scorches on the surface. Within a single week, the Tau find themselves functionally disarmed against an enemy that is evolving in real time to counter their weapons. They are forced to cycle through their arsenal, switching from pulse rifles to railguns to missile pods to ion cannons, and each time they switch, the Tyranids adapt again, forcing another change. It is an arms race played out at biological speed, and the Tau, for all their technological sophistication, simply cannot innovate fast enough to stay ahead. Gorgon also used hypertoxins and weaponized spore clouds to devastating effect, poisoning the air itself and forcing Tau warriors to fight in sealed environmental suits that reduced their combat effectiveness. The fleet even targeted agri-worlds, not just for their biomass, but to taint foodstuffs with dangerous spores before they could be shipped to other worlds. It was biological warfare on a strategic scale, attacking not just the enemy's military but their entire support infrastructure. The Tau eventually managed to defeat Gorgon, but only after suffering casualties that their relatively small population could ill afford, and the experience left a lasting mark on Tau military doctrine. Then there is Hive Fleet Jormungandr. This fleet entered the Imperium from the northeast of the Ultima Segmentum and was supposedly destroyed by Admiral Vortigern Hanroth at the Battle of the Black Nebula in late 995 of the 41st millennium. But destroyed is a relative term when applied to Tyranids. When Hive Fleet Leviathan launched the Third Tyrannic War, many of Jormungandr's supposedly dormant organisms woke up and began causing havoc across the eastern reaches of the Imperium. It turned out that Jormungandr had not been destroyed at all, but had simply gone dormant, its organisms buried beneath the surfaces of dozens of worlds, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to reactivate. Think about the implications of that. The Tyranids are patient enough to seed worlds with sleeping organisms, and then wait for years, decades, possibly centuries for those organisms to be needed. It speaks to a level of long-term strategic planning that most military theorists would consider impossible for any biological organism. And yet the hive mind does it routinely, treating individual worlds the way a chess master treats individual squares on a board, positioning pieces now for advantages that will not manifest for generations. Yet the concept of dormant Tyranid organisms lurking beneath the surface of inhabited worlds is one of the most deeply unsettling aspects of the Tyranid threat. How many worlds in the Imperium are harboring sleeping Tyranid organisms beneath their soil right now? How many planets that believe themselves safe are, in fact, ticking biological time bombs? The Imperium has no systematic way to detect dormant Tyranid organisms, and even if it did, the sheer scale of the problem makes any comprehensive survey impossible. There are 1 million worlds in the Imperium. If even a fraction of a percent of them harbor dormant Tyranid organisms, that is thousands of potential fifth columns, thousands of worlds where the ground itself might one day open up and swallow everything. The Hive Fleet Hydra demonstrated yet another terrifying capability of the Tyranid species. This fleet showed an accelerated ability to replenish its numbers, splitting into multiple smaller fleets that could operate independently while still sharing genetic information through the synaptic network. Each splinter fleet would consume worlds and grow, then split again, producing an ever-expanding web of hive fleets that spread across space like a biological virus. Hydra demonstrated that even when a hive fleet is defeated and broken into fragments, those fragments are not diminished versions of the original. They are seeds. Each one carries the full genetic library of the parent fleet and the full adaptive capability of the hive mind. Given time and biomass, any splinter fleet can grow into a full-scale hive fleet in its own right. Destroying a hive fleet is not like killing an army. It is like shattering a mirror. Each shard reflects the whole, and each shard is capable of growing back into a complete mirror given sufficient resources. But perhaps the most mysterious and unsettling of the minor hive fleets is Hive Fleet Tiamat. This fleet behaves in a way that contradicts almost everything the Imperium understands about Tyranid behavior. Where other hive fleets strip worlds bare and move on, Tiamat has settled. It has claimed a region of space and, instead of consuming the worlds there and moving on, it has begun building something. The planets under Tiamat's control have been transformed into something utterly alien, their surfaces covered with massive organic structures of unknown purpose. As Imperial scout ships that have ventured close enough to observe Tiamat's territory have reported seeing organic constructs of staggering size, structures that cover continents and reach kilometers into the atmosphere. Some observers have described these structures as resembling a vast biological antenna, or perhaps a psychic amplifier. The structures pulse with a faint bioluminescent glow, and the psychic emanations they produce are detectable at extreme range, suggesting that they are generating some kind of signal or field that extends far beyond the system they occupy. No one knows what Tiamat is building, or why, but the theories are all deeply unsettling. Some scholars believe it is constructing a massive psychic beacon to guide the main Tyranid swarm to the galaxy. A signal so powerful that it can be detected across intergalactic distances. If this is the case, then Tiamat is not an anomaly. It is a harbinger, a signal fire lit to call down a swarm so vast that everything the galaxy has faced so far will seem like a gentle breeze before the hurricane. Others think it is building some kind of biological superweapon, a planet-scale organism capable of projecting destructive force on a scale that dwarfs anything in the Tyranid arsenal. Still others believe it is creating something entirely new, something that the galaxy has never seen before and may not be equipped to deal with. Whatever Tiamat is doing, the hive mind clearly considers it important enough to devote an entire hive fleet's resources to the project for an extended period of time, which should concern everyone. The hive mind does not waste resources. Every organism, every world, every scrap of biomass is allocated according to a plan that spans millennia and encompasses galaxies. If Tiamat has been ordered to build something rather than consume, it is because the hive mind has determined that the construction is more valuable than the immediate harvest. And that raises a question that no one in the galaxy wants to contemplate. What could the hive mind possibly need to build that it does not already possess? There is also the fascinating and deeply alarming relationship between the Tyranids and the other major factions of the galaxy, a relationship that often produces unexpected and deeply ironic results. The Octarius War deserves far more attention than it typically receives, because it is one of the most instructive conflicts in the galaxy's history. When Inquisitor Cryptman diverted a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan into the Orc Empire of Octarius, he created a conflict that would rage for years, a war of escalation that produced increasingly dangerous versions of both species. The Orcs, being Orcs, relished the fight. Their biology responded to the constant warfare by producing bigger, tougher, more aggressive specimens. Orc war bosses grew to enormous sizes, their hides thickened by constant combat, their instincts sharpened by fighting an enemy that adapted to their every tactic. The greenskins called out with bellowing war cries that shook the ground, and they threw themselves at the Tyranid swarm with a joy that bordered on religious ecstasy. For the Orcs, the Octarius War was not a catastrophe. Yet it was a party. The Tyranids, meanwhile, adapted to the Orcs' tactics and grew more efficient at countering them with each engagement. Bioforms that had been designed to fight humans were re-engineered to counter the Orcs' particular brand of brutality. Armor plates thickened to withstand the impact of crude but devastatingly powerful Orc weapons. Toxins were developed that could penetrate the Orcs' naturally resilient immune systems. Bioweapons were created that could chew through the ramshackle but surprisingly durable Orc technology. Both species fed off the conflict, and both emerged from each engagement stronger than they had entered it. The result was a war of escalation that had no natural endpoint. The Orcs would never stop fighting, because fighting is what they were made for. The Tyranids would never stop consuming, because consuming is what they exist to do. Every battle produced more experienced Orcs and more adapted Tyranids, which produced more intense battles, which produced even more experienced Orcs, and even more adapted Tyranids, in an endless spiral of escalating violence that threatened to produce combatants more dangerous than the galaxy had ever seen. Some Imperial strategists predicted that the Tyranids would eventually win the Octarius War, because their ability to adapt was simply more comprehensive than the Orcs' ability to evolve. Others predicted an Orc victory, arguing that the Greenskins' love of combat gave them a motivational advantage that no amount of biological engineering could overcome. In the end, the war ground on, consuming resources and lives on a scale that would have been catastrophic for any other species, but was simply business as usual for both the Orcs and the Tyranids. The Necrons present a very different challenge for the Tyranids. The ancient machines are almost entirely inorganic, constructed from a living metal called necrodermis that provides virtually no useful biomass for the Tyranid consumption process. A Necron warrior contains about as much nutritional value to a Tyranid organism as a rock. As a result, Tyranid hive fleets tend to avoid Necron tomb worlds, making major course corrections to steer clear of systems with significant Necron presences. This behavior has been observed on multiple occasions. During the advance of Hive Fleet Behemoth, so tendrils approaching the Necron tomb world of Solemnes made notable diversions to avoid contact with the Necrons, and eventually lapsed into hibernation when they could find no nutrient-rich prey worlds in the area. This avoidance behavior is one of the few recorded instances of Tyranids voluntarily declining a conflict, and it speaks volumes about the pragmatic, resource-conscious nature of the hive mind. The Tyranids do not fight for glory, or territory, or revenge. They fight for food, and the Necrons are not food. Fighting them would expend biomass without replenishing it, a losing proposition for a species whose entire existence is built around the efficient conversion of consumed resources into new organisms. The hive mind is intelligent enough to recognize a bad investment when it sees one. And the Necrons are the worst possible investment in the galaxy, an enemy that costs everything to fight and yields nothing in return. However, this avoidance is not absolute. When Necrons stand between a hive fleet and a desirable target, the Tyranids will fight through them, accepting the losses as the cost of reaching more profitable hunting grounds. And some scholars have speculated that the hive mind may eventually develop bioforms specifically designed to counter Necron technology, should the ancient machines ever become a significant obstacle to the Tyranid advance. Given the hive mind's track record of adapting to every threat it encounters, this speculation is far from idle. The relationship between the Tyranids and Chaos is equally fascinating and deeply complex. The forces of the warp and the creatures of the Imperium exist in a fundamental tension that plays out in unexpected ways when the Tyranids are involved. Demons, being creatures of pure warp energy, provide no biomass for the Tyranids to consume. Fighting them is, from the hive mind's perspective, a waste of resources, energy expended for no return. And yet when Tyranids and demons clash, as they did dramatically during the devastation of Baal, the results can be staggeringly violent. The shadow in the warp actively disrupts warp energy, making it more difficult for demons to manifest and maintain their physical forms in areas where Tyranid's psychic presence is strong. In a sense, the Tyranids and Chaos are natural enemies, not because they hate each other, because the Tyranids are incapable of hate, but because their fundamental natures are incompatible. Chaos feeds on emotion, on fear and anger and desire and hope. The Tyranid hive mind generates none of these things. It is a vast, cold, alien intelligence that provides nothing for the Chaos gods to feast upon. In the presence of the hive mind, the warp itself seems to recoil, and the laughter of thirsting gods falls silent. This has led some radical Imperial scholars to suggest, in hushed tones and behind closed doors, that the Tyranids might actually be the galaxy's best defense against the threat of chaos. If the Tyranid hive mind could somehow be directed against the forces of the warp, its psychic presence could potentially cleanse vast regions of space from demonic influence. But this is purely theoretical, and the cost. Usually the complete consumption of all biological life in those regions would render the cure rather dramatically worse than the disease. It is the equivalent of treating a headache by cutting off the patient's head. Effective perhaps, but not exactly what the doctor ordered. During the opening of the Great Rift, when the galaxy was torn in two by a wound in reality that stretched from one side of the Milky Way to the other, the Tyranids were both hindered and helped by the cataclysm. Some hive fleet tendrils were caught in the warp storms and scattered, their organisms tossed into the Imperium and subjected to forces that even Tyranid biology was not designed to withstand. But the chaos and confusion that the Great Rift caused among the Imperium's defenders also created opportunities for the Tyranids to advance into regions that would otherwise have been too heavily defended to attack. The Fourth Tyrannic War is in many ways a direct consequence of the Great Rift, as the hive mind recognized that the Imperium's attention and resources were focused on the new chaos threat and redirected its forces to strike at the relatively undefended Segmentum Pacificus. The Eldari, for their part, have long recognized the Tyranid threat for what it is. Their Farseers, with their ability to perceive the strands of fate and the potential futures they represent, have seen what the galaxy looks like if the Tyranids are not stopped, and what they have seen has terrified them. Which is saying something for a species that has already experienced the fall of their own civilization and the birth of a chaos god from their collective excesses. The Eldari fight the Tyranids with a desperate intensity that they reserve for existential threats, and they have shown a willingness to cooperate with even their most bitter enemies when the Tyranid threat demands it. The defense of Eandon against Hive Fleet Kraken, the Battle of Valador, where Eldari forces from multiple craft worlds cooperated to prevent two hive fleets from merging. These are examples of a species that understands, at the deepest level, what the Tyranids represent. Let us also consider the emotional and psychological dimension of the Tyranid threat, because warfare is not conducted purely on the physical plane. Morale, willpower, the simple ability to maintain composure in the face of the enemy, these are factors that can determine the outcome of a battle as surely as any weapon or tactic. And in this arena, the Tyranids hold an advantage that is almost impossible to overstate. Fighting the Tyranids is unlike fighting any other enemy in the galaxy. When an Imperial Guardsman faces chaos, he can understand his enemy, however terrifying it might be. The forces of chaos are driven by recognizable emotions, corrupted and twisted though they may be. anger, ambition, despair, pleasure. These are human emotions, and fighting against them is, on some primal level, a fight against the darkness within oneself. There is a psychological framework for understanding chaos, a way to process the threat that allows the human mind to maintain some grip on its sanity. Yet you can hate a Chaos Space Marine, you can fear a demon, but at least you can comprehend what motivates them, and that comprehension, however small, provides a foothold for the mind to cling to. When a guardsman faces orcs, there is something almost reassuring about the encounter, if such a word can be applied to a combat situation. Orcs are loud, aggressive, and straightforward. They charge, they shoot, they fight. They bellow their battle cries with an enthusiasm that borders on infectious. There is no subtlety, no mystery, no cosmic horror. Fighting orcs is terrifying, certainly, but it is a kind of terror that the human mind can process and respond to. The orc is a foe you can see, a foe you can understand, a foe you can, on some level, even respect for the sheer exuberance it brings to the art of violence. But the Tyranids offer none of these psychological handholds. They are utterly, completely, incomprehensibly alien. They do not speak, they do not negotiate, they do not posture or threaten or make demands. They do not even seem to notice you as an individual. They simply come, in numbers beyond counting, driven by a hunger so vast and so ancient that it precedes the existence of the human species by untold millions of years. There is no anger in their eyes, because most of them do not have eyes in any recognizable sense. There is no malice in their actions, because malice requires a personal motivation that the Tyranid organisms simply do not possess. They are not trying to hurt you. They are not trying to scare you. They do not even really acknowledge your existence as a person. To the hive mind, you are not an enemy to be defeated. Yet you are a resource to be harvested. A calorie count in a biomass calculation. That knowledge, that understanding that you are fighting not an enemy, but a force of nature, that your death will mean nothing to the thing that kills you. That you are as insignificant to the Tyranid swarm as a single grain of sand is to an ocean wave. That is a form of psychological warfare, more devastating than any battle cry or terrifying visage could ever be. It strips away the comforting illusion that the universe cares about your existence, that your life has meaning in the grand scheme of things, that your death will be noticed by anyone other than the people standing next to you. It reduces warfare to its most primal, its most stripped-down essence: kill or be consumed. There is no glory in fighting the Tyranids. There is only survival. And the knowledge that survival is, in the long run, temporary. The sensory experience of a Tyranid assault compounds this psychological devastation. The sounds of a Tyranid swarm in motion have been described by survivors as unlike anything else in their experience. The chittering of billions of mandibles creates a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates through the ground and the air and the bones of anyone standing nearby. The wet, organic sounds of Tyranid bioweapons firing, a cross between a cough and a retch that is somehow more disturbing than the clean crack of a bolter or the whoosh of a plasma weapon. The keening psychic scream that carnifexes emit as they charge, a sound that registers not in the ears, but in the mind itself, a blast of pure alien aggression that can stun unprepared soldiers into paralysis. Oh, the bass rumble of trigons burrowing beneath the ground, a vibration that makes the earth itself feel unstable, that robs the defender of the most basic certainty, the certainty that the ground beneath their feet is solid. And underlying it all, constant and inescapable, the hum of the hive mind's psychic presence, felt rather than heard, pressing against the inside of the skull like a migraine that will not go away, a pressure that builds and builds until it feels like the mind itself might crack under the strain. These sounds build upon each other, layering and overlapping until they create a wall of noise that is physically painful and psychologically overwhelming. Soldiers who have survived Tyranid engagements frequently report symptoms similar to severe trauma, including nightmares of chittering darkness, an hypervigilance that persists for years after the battle, and an inability to tolerate enclosed spaces, which trigger memories of being surrounded by the swarm with no way out, and no way to fight, and no way to escape. Let us also discuss the recent developments in the Tyranid arsenal, because the hive mind has not been standing still during the Fourth Tyrannic War. It has been introducing new bioforms at a rate that has alarmed even the most experienced Ordo-Xenos investigators, organisms that represent significant advancements in the Tyranid evolutionary toolkit, and that suggest the hive mind is preparing for a conflict of unprecedented scale. The Neurotyrant is one such organism, a horrifying floating mass of tentacles and swollen cranial tissue, as it serves as an incredibly powerful synapse node that amplifies the shadow in the warp to excruciating levels in its vicinity. Where a standard synapse creature projects the hive mind's will like a radio transmitter, the Neurotyrant is more like a psychic amplifier, taking the already formidable pressure of the shadow and focusing it into a concentrated beam of mental oppression that can reduce even hardened soldiers to gibbering wrecks. Its brain has been swollen to immense proportions, occupying most of its body mass, and giving it the appearance of a grotesquely enlarged head trailing a mass of prehensile tentacles. It does not walk, it floats, suspended above the ground by the sheer psychic energy that radiates from its overdeveloped cranium, in the presence of a Neurotyrant en sa source. The psychological effects of the shadow in the warp are multiplied tenfold. Latent psychers in the vicinity may spontaneously combust from the psychic overload. Even non-psychic individuals experience intense migraines, visual distortions, and a crushing sense of despair that saps their will to fight. The neurotyrant does not need to fire a single weapon to be devastatingly effective. Its mere presence is a weapon, a zone of psychic oppression that weakens and disorients everything around it, while simultaneously strengthening the hive mind's control over its own organisms. The Norn Emissary is another recent addition, and one that suggests the hive mind is escalating its commitment to the Fourth Tyrannic War in ways that the Imperium is only beginning to understand. The Norn Emissary is essentially a mobile extension of the Norn Queen herself, a creature that carries within it a fragment of the Norn Queen's consciousness and the genetic material of every bioform the fleet has produced. It is a walking biological library, a repository of evolutionary knowledge that can rapidly produce new adaptations on the battlefield itself. When a Norn Emissary is deployed, it is a sign that the hive mind considers the engagement significant enough to risk exposing a piece of its most precious biological heritage to potential harm. It is, in effect, the hive mind saying, "This battle matters enough to bring our best." The psychophage represents yet another alarming development. This bioform feeds specifically on psychic energy, while hunting psychers with a single-minded determination that suggests the hive mind has identified psychic-capable individuals as a priority target. In a galaxy where psychers are becoming increasingly common, where the Great Rift has thinned the barriers between the material universe and the warp, and caused a surge in the number of humans born with psychic potential, the appearance of a bioform specifically designed to neutralize this growing capability is deeply strategic. The psychophage does not just kill psychers, it drains them, consuming their psychic energy and leaving them as hollow, burned-out shells that are somehow worse than dead. For an Imperium that depends on psychers for communication, navigation, and increasingly for combat, the psychophage is a targeted attack on one of humanity's most critical strategic assets. And then there are the Barbgaunts, Neurogaunts, and von Ryan's Leapers, each representing a refinement of existing Tyranid capabilities. The Barbgaunts are living artillery pieces, their bloated bodies serving as platforms for biological weapons that fire in devastating barrages, providing the swarm with indirect fire support that it has historically lacked. The Neurogaunts are small, scuttling creatures that extend the range of nearby synapse creatures, ensuring that the hive mind's control reaches even the most remote corners of a battlefield. The von Ryan's Leapers are fast, deadly stealth predators, whose ability to ambush from unexpected positions makes them the bane of any rear echelon unit that thought it was safe from the frontline swarm. Each of these new bioforms represents a problem that did not exist a generation ago. Each one forces the Imperium's tacticians to develop new countermeasures, new doctrines, new weapons. And by the time those countermeasures are developed and deployed, the hive mind will have already moved on, producing the next generation of organisms designed to overcome whatever new defenses humanity has erected. It is an arms race that humanity can delay but never win, because the Tyranids' ability to innovate is limited only by the laws of biology, while humanity's ability to innovate is constrained by bureaucracy, tradition, superstition, and the crushing weight of a civilization that has been in decline for 10,000 years. There is a concept in military theory called the OODA loop, which describes the cycle by which a combatant processes information and responds to threats. Observe, orient, decide, act. As the faction that can cycle through this loop fastest has a significant advantage in any conflict. By this measure, the Tyranids possess perhaps the fastest strategic OODA loop of any faction in the galaxy. They observe through billions of sensory organisms spread across every battlefield. They orient through the hive mind, which processes this information with a speed and comprehensiveness that no human or alien command structure can match. They decide with a clarity and unity of purpose that eliminates the delays, disagreements, and compromises that slow down every other faction's decision-making process. And they act through every organism simultaneously, with a coordination that makes the most disciplined military formation in the galaxy look sluggish by comparison. The Imperium's OODA loop, by contrast, this is perhaps the slowest in the galaxy. Information from the front lines must travel through layers of bureaucracy before reaching anyone with the authority to act on it. Decisions are delayed by interdepartmental rivalries, theological debates about whether a particular weapon or tactic is sanctioned by the Emperor, and the simple logistical challenge of communicating across a civilization that spans a million worlds. By the time the Imperium develops a response to a new Tyranid bioform, the hive mind has already produced 2 more and retired the one the Imperium was trying to counter. This mismatch in adaptive speed is, in the long run, far more dangerous than any individual battle or campaign. The Imperium can win battles against the Tyranids. It has proven this repeatedly throughout the Tyrannic Wars. But winning battles is not the same as winning the war, and the war against the Tyranids is a war of adaptation, a contest to see which side can evolve faster. In that contest, the Tyranids hold every advantage. They adapt in real time. The Imperium adapts over generations. That differential, compounded over centuries and millennia, will eventually prove decisive. Let us take a moment to consider something that often gets lost in the grand strategic analysis: the individual stories, the small moments that reveal the true nature of the Tyranid threat far more effectively than any chart or statistic ever could. There is an account, preserved in the archives of the Ordo Xenos, of a planetary governor named Helene Cord on a world called Dalsis Tertius. Dalsis Tertius was a modest agri-world, and home to perhaps 30 million people whose primary purpose was growing grain for the hive worlds of the neighboring sector. It was the kind of world that appears in no history books, that features in no famous battles, that exists as nothing more than a line item in the Imperium's vast agricultural ledgers. Governor Cord had served faithfully for 22 years, managing the planet's harvest quotas and maintaining the infrastructure that kept the grain flowing to the hungry billions who depended on it. She was, by all accounts, a competent and unremarkable administrator of an unremarkable world. When the shadow in the warp fell over Dalsis Tertius, Governor Cord followed her training. She activated the planetary defense protocols, mobilized the local militia, and attempted to send a distress signal to the sector naval base at Haros Prime. The signal never arrived. The astropaths who attempted to send it collapsed, blood streaming from their eyes and ears, screaming about a presence in the warp that was swallowing all light and all sound and all hope. The navigators reported that the warp had become a wall of white noise, impenetrable and absolute. Dalsis Tertius was alone. The genestealer cult that had been gestating in the planet's mining communities for 3 generations chose that moment to reveal itself. The miners, many of them 4th and 5th generation hybrids who appeared perfectly human to casual inspection, seized the planet's primary communications hub and its main promethium refinery. When the militia attempted to retake these positions, they found themselves fighting people they had known for years, neighbors and colleagues, and in some cases family members, whose devotion to the patriarch had been hidden behind a lifetime of carefully maintained normalcy. The shock of this betrayal, the realization that the enemy had been among them all along, broke the militia's cohesion as surely as any Tyranid bioweapon could have. Governor Cord retreated to the planetary capital with whatever forces she could rally and attempted to organize a defense. She knew it was futile. She had read the reports from the Tyrannic Wars, and she knew that no agri-world had ever survived a full-scale Tyranid assault without significant outside assistance that she knew was not coming. But she chose to fight anyway, because the alternative was to surrender. And surrender to the Tyranids is not really surrender at all. It is simply the choice to be consumed standing up rather than lying down. The hive fleet arrived 3 days after the shadow fell. It was a small tendril, barely a fraction of a percent of the main fleet's total biomass, but it was more than enough for a world like Dalsis Tertius. The sky darkened with mycetic spores as they fell like fleshy rain, splitting open upon impact and releasing their cargo of chitin-armored nightmares onto the golden fields of grain that had been the planet's pride and purpose. Governor Cord watched from the walls of the capital as the swarm advanced across the landscape, the endless wave of creatures consuming the grain fields as they came, not stopping to eat, but simply absorbing the plant matter as they moved, incorporating it into their bodies in real time, like a vast biological sponge rolling across the earth. The defense of the capital lasted 16 hours. It was not a famous last stand. There were no space marines to turn the tide, no legendary generals to rally the troops, no miraculous interventions by the forces of the Emperor. It was 30 million ordinary people, farmers and laborers and shopkeepers and bureaucrats, fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them by a factor that defied calculation, with weapons that ranged from military-grade laser guns to farming implements and kitchen knives. They fought because they had no choice, and because giving up felt worse than dying. Governor Cord's last recorded transmission was picked up by a passing merchant vessel that had been forced out of warp by the Shadow's interference. The transmission was garbled, fragmented by the psychic static that pervaded the system, but the essential message was clear. Dalsis Tertius is lost. We fought. Remember us. By the time Imperial forces arrived to investigate the loss of contact with the planet, 6 months later, there was nothing left. Not the grain fields, not the cities, not the people, not even the atmosphere. Just a ball of bare rock, orbiting a star that no longer had any reason to shine on anything. Governor Helene Cord's name appears nowhere in the great histories of the Tyrannic Wars. Her world merits no more than a footnote in the Ordo Xenos records, one of thousands of worlds consumed during the advance of the various hive fleets. But her story, and the stories of the millions of people who lived and died on Dalsis Tertius, is the story of the Tyranid threat stripped of all its grand strategic context and reduced to its most essential truth. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, erased so completely that not even their memory survives. That is what the Tyranids do. Not just to worlds, but to people, to communities, to histories, to the accumulated weight of human experience that gives a civilization its meaning and its purpose. The Orcs destroy. Chaos corrupts. The Necrons conquer. But the Tyranids erase. They leave nothing behind. No ruins to explore. No artifacts to study. No stories to tell. When the Tyranids are done, it is as if you never existed at all. And in a universe where memory and legacy are among the few things that give meaning to existence, that erasure is perhaps the most terrible fate of all. But consider the scale of what has already been lost. Hundreds of worlds consumed during the First, Second, Third, and Fourth Tyrannic Wars. billions upon billions of lives snuffed out. Not in battle, not in conquest, but in consumption. Entire cultures, entire histories, entire genetic lineages that stretched back thousands of years, all of them dissolved into nutrient paste and pumped up into hive ships to be incorporated into the next generation of killing machines. The sheer magnitude of this loss is difficult to comprehend. We can talk about billions of dead, but the number is so large that it loses all meaning. The human mind simply cannot process death on that scale. It becomes an abstraction, a statistic, a number on a page that carries no more emotional weight than a budget figure or a census report. But each one of those billions was a person, someone who had a name, a family, hopes for the future, memories of the past, someone who woke up on a particular morning and ate a particular breakfast and said goodbye to someone they loved, not knowing that this would be the last day of their existence, or that the manner of their ending would be so complete that not even their bones would remain to mark the place where they had lived and died. When we talk about the Tyranid threat, we must never lose sight of this fundamental truth. The Tyranids do not kill people. They unmake them. They reduce the sum total of a human life, all its joys and sorrows and accomplishments and failures, to calories in a biological equation that has no solution and no end. Now let me address something that has been debated in the lore community for decades, and which I think is central to understanding why the Tyranids represent the true existential threat to the galaxy. It is the question of what the Tyranids are actually doing, not in the immediate tactical sense of consuming worlds, but in the grand strategic sense. What is the hive mind's ultimate goal? Some scholars argue that the Tyranids have no goal beyond simple consumption. They are, in this view, a biological force of nature, an apex predator species that has evolved to consume everything in its environment and move on, like a swarm of locusts on a galactic scale. They consume because consuming is what they do, and there is no deeper purpose or meaning behind their actions. But this view does not survive close examination. The behavior of the hive mind is too sophisticated, too clearly directed by strategic thought, just to be explained by simple instinct. The Tyranid hive fleets do not attack randomly. They coordinate their movements, time their assaults, and allocate their resources with a precision that speaks of genuine intelligence and long-term planning. Hive Fleet Tiamat's construction project, the Octarius War Gambit, the diversion of fleets around Necron tomb worlds, the timing of the Fourth Tyrannic War to coincide with the Imperium's distraction by the Great Rift, all of these suggest a mind that thinks in terms of centuries and plans on a galactic scale. Other scholars have proposed that the Tyranids are fleeing something, that the Hive Fleet's relentless advance into our galaxy is not an invasion, but a migration, driven by some threat so vast and so terrible that even the Tyranid hive mind has chosen flight over fight. This theory is supported by the observation that the hive fleets are approaching from multiple directions around the galaxy's edge, which is consistent with a species that is converging on a central point from a wide dispersal pattern, exactly what you would expect if they were being driven ahead of some expanding threat. If this theory is correct, then the Tyranids are not the real danger. They are the harbinger of something far worse, a cosmic predator that has consumed everything in the intergalactic void and is now turning its attention to the oases of life that exist within galaxies. Whatever the truth, the implications are deeply unsettling. If the Tyranids are simply consuming because that is their nature, then the galaxy faces an enemy whose appetite is literally infinite, whose hunger cannot be satisfied, and whose advance can only be delayed, never stopped. If they are running from something, then the galaxy faces not one, but two existential threats, and the one it has not yet met may be orders of magnitude more dangerous than the one it is already losing to. There is another dimension to the Tyranid threat that is often overlooked, the economic dimension. The Imperium of Man is, at its core, an economic entity. Its armies are sustained by taxes and tithes. Its fleets are built in shipyards that require raw materials and skilled labor. Its defenses depend on a supply chain that stretches across 1 million worlds and requires the smooth functioning of hundreds of billions of individual economic transactions to maintain. Yet the Imperium fights not just with soldiers and weapons, but with grain and fuel and ammunition and medical supplies, and the countless other necessities that keep a galactic civilization running. The Tyranids attack this economic foundation with devastating effectiveness. Every agri-world they consume is a world that will never again produce food for the hive worlds that depend on it. Every forge world they threaten must divert resources from production to defense, reducing the output of weapons and material that other fronts desperately need. Every shipping lane they interdict is a lane that can no longer carry the goods that keep the Imperium's economy functioning. The shadow in the warp disrupts not just psychic communication, but the astropathic messaging system on which Imperial commerce depends, throwing entire sectors into economic chaos. The cumulative effect of these economic disruptions is potentially more damaging than the direct military losses inflicted by the Tyranid invasions. The Imperium can replace soldiers. It can, slowly and painfully, build new ships and forge new weapons. But it cannot replace the economic infrastructure that the Tyranids destroy. And without that infrastructure, the military machine that defends the Imperium against all its other enemies begins to falter. Every world consumed by the Tyranids weakens the Imperium, not just by the loss of that world's population and resources, but by the cascading effect, that loss has on the dozens or hundreds of other worlds that depended on its output. Food shortages lead to civil unrest. Material shortages lead to reduced military production. But communication disruptions lead to confusion and misallocation of resources. Each of these problems feeds into the others, creating a downward spiral that the Imperium's sclerotic bureaucracy is ill-equipped to arrest. This economic dimension helps explain why the Fourth Tyrannic War is so particularly dangerous. The Tyranids are not attacking a single world, or even a single sector. They are attacking the Segmentum Pacificus, one of the 5 major divisions of the galaxy, with multiple fleets that are targeting different regions simultaneously. The economic disruption caused by this multi-front assault is staggering, straining supply lines and production capacities across the entire western half of the Imperium, at a time when those resources are already stretched thin by the ongoing wars against Chaos, the Necrons, and the Orcs. This let us also address the question of command and control, because the Tyranid system of warfare is, from a purely military standpoint, perhaps the most efficient in the galaxy. The hive mind is, in effect, a supreme commander who has perfect situational awareness across every battlefield simultaneously, who can issue orders to every single organism under its control instantaneously, and whose decisions are carried out without question, without delay, and without the kind of interpretation errors that plague every other command structure in the galaxy. Compare this to the Imperium's command structure. An Imperial commander on a battlefield must rely on Auspex readings that may be inaccurate, Vox communications that may be jammed, and subordinates who may misunderstand, misinterpret, or simply fail to carry out orders as intended. Just the commander's understanding of the battlefield is always incomplete, always delayed, always filtered through multiple layers of reporting that introduce errors and biases at every stage. The Imperial command structure is, to put it plainly, a vast and complicated machine for converting information into confusion. The hive mind has none of these problems. Every organism is a sensor. Every organism is a communicator. Every organism is a direct extension of the hive mind's will, as obedient and responsive as the fingers on your hand. When the hive mind decides to shift the focus of an assault from the enemy's left flank to their right, that shift happens instantly, simultaneously, across every organism on the battlefield. There is no communication delay. There is no confusion about orders. There is no arguing, no hesitation, no ego, no fear. The swarm moves as one because it is one, a single intelligence directing 1 billion bodies with a precision that no conventional command structure could ever hope to match. This unity of purpose and action gives the Tyranids an enormous tactical advantage in every engagement. They can concentrate force faster than any enemy can respond. They can feint in one direction and attack from another with a coordination that seems almost telepathic because it literally is telepathic. They can sacrifice organisms on one front to create an advantage on another without any of the morale concerns that would make such a sacrifice problematic for any other army. The swarm does not care about individual casualties because individual organisms have no value to the hive mind except insofar as they contribute to the collective effort. Some scholars have compared the hive mind's command style to that of the ancient Terran chess grandmasters, who could envision the entire board and plan dozens of moves ahead while their opponents struggled to think 3 or 4 moves into the future. But this comparison undersells the hive mind's capability. A chess grandmaster is playing one game on one board. The hive mind is playing millions of simultaneous games on boards that span the galaxy, and it is winning more of them than it is losing. The sheer computational power required to coordinate a multi-front galactic invasion while simultaneously managing the biological evolution of millions of different organism types, while simultaneously planning strategic initiatives decades in advance, while simultaneously processing the sensory input of trillions of individual organisms. It is staggering beyond comprehension, and the hive mind does all of this without technology. No computers, no networks, no communication relays, just biology. Pure, refined, perfected biology that has been evolving for longer than the stars that light the Milky Way have been burning. It is, in a sense, the universe's ultimate proof of concept for biological intelligence, the demonstration that flesh and sinew and nerve, given enough time and enough evolutionary pressure, can achieve anything that silicon and metal can achieve, and more. This brings me to what I consider the most chilling aspect of the Tyranid threat, and the one that most clearly establishes them as the real threat in Warhammer 40,000. It is the question of what the galaxy looks like if the Tyranids win. And because every faction in the galaxy has a vision for what the galaxy would look like under their dominion, and for most of them, that vision includes some form of continued existence, however unpleasant. If the Imperium endures, the galaxy remains as it is, grim, dark, and oppressive, but populated. Billions of humans live, work, worship, and die under the watchful gaze of the Golden Throne. It is not a pleasant existence, but it is an existence, and within it there is room for hope, for love, for beauty, for all the things that make life worth living, however constrained they may be by the circumstances of the setting. If chaos conquers, the galaxy becomes a nightmare of endless suffering and mutation. The warp and reality merge into a hellscape of eternal torment. It is horrifying beyond description, but there is still something there. And those souls still exist, even if they exist in agony. The galaxy is transformed, corrupted, damned, but it is not empty. There is still consciousness, still experience, even if that experience is nothing but pain. If the Necrons reclaim their dominion, the galaxy becomes a mausoleum of living metal and enslaved populations. The flesh and blood species become servants or are eliminated, and the ancient machines rule over a silent, orderly empire that stretches from one end of the galaxy to the other. It is cold and sterile and profoundly depressing, but there is still something there. The Necrons have their own form of consciousness, their own culture, their own history. The galaxy under Necron rule would be diminished, but not empty. Even if the Orcs somehow manage to overrun the galaxy, and do not laugh, because in sheer numbers, they might actually be capable of it, the result would be a galaxy-spanning riot of permanent warfare, chaotic, violent, and absurd, but alive, teeming with the raucous energy of a species that exists purely for the joy of combat. The galaxy under Orc rule would be loud and destructive and utterly insane, but it would not be silent. There would still be something happening, even if that something was nothing more than 1 trillion greenskins having the time of their lives, bashing each other over the head with increasingly improbable weapons. But if the Tyranids win? If the hive fleets consume every world, devour every organism, strip every planet down to bare rock and move on? What then? Nothing. That is the answer. Nothing. The galaxy becomes a vast, silent graveyard of dead worlds orbiting dying stars. No life, well, no consciousness, no experience of any kind. Not even the tortured existence of a chaos-corrupted hellscape or the sterile order of a Necron dynasty. Just emptiness. Cold, absolute, eternal emptiness. The stars would continue to burn. The planets would continue to orbit. But there would be nothing left to see them. No consciousness to marvel at the beauty of a sunrise or feel the warmth of a star on bare skin. The galaxy would be as lifeless and as meaningless as it was before the first organic molecule formed in the primordial ooze of the first life-bearing world, billions of years ago. That is the ultimate horror of the Tyranid threat. It is not the violence of their attacks, or the grotesque appearance of their bioforms, or the alien nature of their intelligence. It is the outcome they represent, total extinction. Not the extinction of a single species, or a single civilization, or even a single galaxy, but the extinction of experience itself. The end of everything that has ever mattered to anyone who has ever lived. And the most terrifying thing about this outcome is that the Tyranids are winning. Slowly, incrementally, one world at a time, they are advancing. The hive fleets grow larger with each world they consume. The hive mind grows more intelligent with each new genetic sample it absorbs. The bioforms grow more deadly with each battle they fight. And the forces arrayed against them, the Imperium, the Eldari, the Tau, even the Orcs and the Necrons, are all being worn down by the constant pressure of 12 different wars on 12 different fronts. The Tyranids do not need to win every battle. They just need to keep consuming, keep growing, keep adapting, until the balance finally tips irreversibly in their favor. And with every world that falls, with every fleet that is destroyed, with every army that is overwhelmed, that tipping point grows closer. The galaxy is running out of time. The question is no longer whether the Tyranids can be defeated. The question is whether they can be slowed down enough for the galaxy's other inhabitants to find a solution before it is too late. And right now, looking at the state of the Fourth Tyrannic War, at the Imperium's fractured defenses and divided attention, at the relentless advance of the hive fleets from every direction, the honest answer is, probably not. But then again, the Imperium has survived against impossible odds before. It has endured 10,000 years of constant warfare, while against enemies that should have destroyed it 100 times over. It has produced heroes and martyrs and geniuses whose actions have turned the tide at the last possible moment, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat with a regularity that defies statistical probability. Perhaps it will do so again. Perhaps someone, somewhere, will find the weapon, or the strategy, or the miracle that turns the Tyranid tide. But until that day comes, the Tyranids remain what they have always been, the real threat, the one enemy that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be corrupted, cannot be intimidated, cannot be bribed, cannot be outlasted, cannot be outproduced, and cannot be outthought. The enemy that does not want to conquer the galaxy, or rule it, or change it. The enemy that wants to eat it. All of it. Every world, every ocean, every forest, every creature, every last scrap of organic matter, consumed and converted and added to the ever-growing mass of the hive fleet as it moves on to the next galaxy and the next, forever, until there is nothing left anywhere in the universe for it to devour. That is the scale of the existential risk we are discussing here. But to fully appreciate it, we need to go even deeper. Let us delve deeper into some of the most fascinating aspects of Tyranid biology that we have not yet fully explored, because understanding the engineering behind the swarm gives us an even greater appreciation for the scale of the threat it represents. Consider the Norn Queen, the biological heart of every hive fleet. We touched on this organism earlier, but it deserves a much more thorough examination. The Norn Queen is not simply a reproductive organism. She's a biological supercomputer, a genetic library, and a manufacturing facility all rolled into one. Deep within the bowels of the largest hive ships, she sits surrounded by spawning pools and biovats that churn with the raw material of life itself. Her body, swollen to immense proportions, is connected to the hive ship by thousands of bioorganic cables and tendrils that feed her a constant stream of nutrients and genetic data. She processes this data with a brain that is, pound for pound, more complex than anything else in the known galaxy, analyzing the genetic information of every organism the fleet has consumed and using it to design new bioforms that incorporate the most useful traits. The process by which the Norn Queen creates new bioforms is, as far as the Magos Biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have been able to determine, a form of directed evolution that operates at speeds that should be biologically impossible. In natural evolution, beneficial mutations arise randomly and are selected for over thousands of generations. The Norn Queen skips this process entirely, selecting the traits she wants from her vast genetic library and combining them with a precision that suggests genuine understanding of the underlying biological mechanisms. She does not wait for random chance to produce a useful adaptation. She designs it, tests it, refines it, and deploys it, all within a time frame that would make the most advanced genetic engineering facility in the Imperium look like a child playing with building blocks. The variety of organisms she produces is staggering. From the smallest ripper swarm to the largest biotitan, from the simplest spore mine to the most complex hive tyrant, every single Tyranid bioform is the product of the Norn Queen's biological engineering. She can produce organisms adapted for any environment, any enemy, any tactical situation. Need a creature that can survive in the vacuum of space. The Norn Queen can design one. Need a bioform that is immune to a specific type of radiation. Give her a sample, and she will have a prototype ready within days. Need an organism that can digest a mineral that no known life form has ever been able to metabolize. She will find a way. There are no biological problems that the Norn Queen cannot solve, given sufficient time and resources. The hive ships themselves are among the most remarkable organisms in the Tyranid fleet, and they deserve special attention because they are so often treated as simple transport vessels when they are, in fact, far more than that. A hive ship is a living creature, a vast biological organism that can be tens of kilometers in length, with a mass measured in gigatons, and a metabolism that would be the envy of a small star. Its hull is composed of layers of chitinous armor, so thick and so dense that it can absorb the impact of macro cannon shells and lance strikes that would vaporize a conventional starship. Its weapon systems are biological, enormous bioplasma batteries and acid-spitting turrets and tentacles that can reach across the void of space to grapple with enemy ships and crush them like tin cans. But the hive ship's most impressive feature is its ability to heal. On a conventional warship that takes serious damage in battle must be repaired in a shipyard, a process that can take months or even years and requires enormous quantities of raw materials and skilled labor. A hive ship simply grows new tissue to replace what was lost, regenerating hull breaches and weapon systems with a speed that is directly proportional to the amount of biomass available to it. After a battle, hive ships that have taken significant damage will often retreat to the edges of a system and begin consuming asteroids, comets, or even the smaller moons of gas giants, using the raw material to fuel their regeneration. Within weeks, a hive ship that was listing and burning after a major engagement can be fully restored, its wounds healed, its weapons recharged, and its holds full of freshly spawned organisms ready for the next assault. The interior of a hive ship is a biological nightmare, a labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers and spawning pools that is constantly shifting and changing as the ship grows and adapts. The corridors are lined with a living membrane that pulses with bioluminescent light, casting everything in a sickly greenish glow. The air is thick with spores and the stench of biological processes that human olfactory senses were never designed to process. The floors are not solid but semi-organic, a layer of living tissue that absorbs footsteps and gives slightly underfoot, as if the ship itself is aware of and reacting to the presence of intruders. Sounds echo strangely through the organic corridors, amplified and distorted by the ship's internal structures, so that a whisper can sound like a shout, and a shout can be swallowed entirely by the living walls. Imperial boarding actions against hive ships are among the most dangerous operations that any soldier can undertake. The ship itself is hostile, actively working against intruders by sealing corridors, flooding chambers with toxic gases, and spawning defensive organisms from the very walls. Navigation is nearly impossible because the ship's internal layout changes constantly. A corridor that leads to the central bioreactor 1 hour may lead to a dead end the next, and the spawning pools that produce defensive organisms can create fully grown warriors from raw biomass in a matter of minutes. The kill teams that are sent into hive ships know that they are, in a very real sense, walking into the belly of a beast that is actively trying to digest them. Now, let me speak about one of the most hotly debated topics in Tyranid lore, the question of what drew the hive fleets to our galaxy in the first place. There are two primary theories, and both of them have deeply unsettling implications. The first and most widely accepted theory concerns the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that is projected from the Golden Throne on Terra by the Emperor himself. The Astronomicon is the lighthouse that guides Imperial ships through the warp, a blazing psychic signal that can be detected across the entire galaxy, and, according to this theory, well beyond it. The Astronomicon has been broadcasting for 10,000 years, a constant, unwavering signal that says, in the simplest possible terms, Life is here. Intelligence is here. Now, biomass is here. Come and get it. According to this theory, the Tyranid hive mind detected the Astronomicon from the intergalactic void and has been traveling toward it ever since, drawn by the signal like moths to a flame. If this is true, then the Emperor's greatest achievement, the Astronomicon that makes interstellar travel possible for humanity, is also the thing that called down the most terrible enemy the galaxy has ever faced. It is an irony so perfect that it borders on cruel. The second theory involves the Pharos device on the world of Sotha during the Horus Heresy. The Pharos was a pre-human artifact that functioned as a navigation device and communications beacon. During the Heresy, it was activated to its full power to aid the Ultramarines in their creation of the secondary empire known as Imperium Secundus. At maximum output, the Pharos emitted a signal of such incredible power that it was detected across enormous distances, potentially well beyond the galaxy's edge. When the Pharos was ultimately destroyed, the resulting psychic cataclysm sent a final, massive pulse of energy out into the void. According to this theory, it was this pulse, this single catastrophic blast of psychic energy, that served as the dinner bell for the Tyranid swarm. The hive fleets detected the signal, triangulated its source, and began their long journey toward our galaxy. There is evidence supporting both theories, and some scholars believe that both may be partially correct, that the Pharos pulse drew the hive mind's initial attention, and the Astronomicon has been guiding it in ever since, whatever the truth. Here, the implication is the same. The Tyranids came because we called them. Humanity's own actions, its own technology, its own desperate attempts to light a candle in the darkness of the void are what brought the darkness to their door. It is perhaps the greatest unintended consequence in the history of the galaxy, and it is a burden that humanity will bear for as long as the Tyranid threat endures. Let me also speak more about the Swarmlord, because this creature is in many ways the most terrifying individual organism in the Tyranid arsenal, and it represents a capability that no other Tyranid bioform possesses. The Swarmlord is unique among Tyranid creatures in that it appears to be a singular entity, an individual with a continuous identity that persists across multiple physical incarnations. When a Swarmlord's body is destroyed, the hive mind simply grows a new one, and the consciousness that inhabited the old body is transferred to the new one with all its memories, all its tactical experience, and all its accumulated knowledge intact. This makes the Swarmlord functionally immortal, not in the way that a demon is immortal, sustained by the energies of the warp, but in a way that's far more pragmatic and, in its own way, far more disturbing. Each time the Swarmlord is reborn, it retains everything it learned in its previous incarnation. Every battle it has fought, every enemy tactic it has encountered, every strategic lesson it has absorbed, all of this knowledge carries forward into the next body. The Swarmlord that the Imperium faces today is the same Swarmlord that fought Manos Calgar at the Battle of Cold Steel Ridge during the First Tyrannic War. It's the same entity that faced the Aeldari at the defense of Iyanden, the same intelligence that has been directing Tyranid forces in major engagements for centuries. The combat record of the Swarmlord is extraordinary. It has faced some of the most formidable warriors in the galaxy, including Chapter Master Calgar of the Ultramarines, who is himself one of the most accomplished combatants in the Imperium. During the Battle of Cold Steel Ridge, the Swarmlord defeated Calgar in single combat, a feat that very few beings in the galaxy have ever accomplished. Calgar survived only because his honor guards sacrificed themselves to buy him time to retreat, and even then, he was so severely wounded that it took him months to recover. What makes this encounter particularly instructive is what happened after. Well, when the Swarmlord next encountered Ultramarines forces, its tactics had been refined to specifically counter the strategies that the Ultramarines had used against it in the previous engagement. It anticipated their maneuvers, predicted their responses, and positioned its forces to exploit the specific weaknesses of the Codex Astartes tactical doctrine. The Swarmlord was not just fighting the Ultramarines, it was studying them, learning from each engagement, and carrying those lessons forward into the next battle. This learning ability extends to non-combat situations as well. During the invasion of Baal, the Swarmlord demonstrated an understanding of the Blood Angels' defensive doctrine that could only have come from careful analysis of their previous engagements. It identified the weak points in their fortress monastery's defenses with uncanny precision, directed its forces to exploit those weaknesses with surgical accuracy, and adapted its strategy in real time as the Blood Angels attempted to adjust their defense. The implications of a Tyranid commander that gets smarter with every battle it fights, that carries forward a cumulative record of every engagement the Tyranids have ever fought against every enemy they have ever faced, are profoundly disturbing. The Swarmlord of today is exponentially more dangerous than the Swarmlord that first appeared during the First Tyrannic War. The Swarmlord of tomorrow will be more dangerous still. Given enough time, given enough battles, the Swarmlord will eventually develop a complete tactical understanding of every faction in the galaxy. A database of weaknesses and counter strategies so comprehensive that no conventional military formation will be able to surprise it. The Imperium's response to the Tyranid threat has been varied, and not always effective. But there is one organization that deserves specific mention: the Death Watch. The Death Watch is a chapter of Space Marines, drawn from dozens of different chapters, assembled specifically to fight the alien threats that menace the Imperium. Among these threats, the Tyranids hold a special place, and the Death Watch has developed a body of tactical doctrine specifically designed for anti-Tyranid warfare that is unmatched in the Imperium.
The Death Watch's approach to fighting the Tyranids is fundamentally different from the standard Imperial doctrine of holding ground and maintaining defensive lines. The Death Watch understands that the Tyranids cannot be outfought in a war of attrition. There are simply too many of them, and they reproduce too fast for any amount of killing to make a permanent difference. Instead, the Death Watch focuses on disrupting the hive mind's control network, targeting synapse creatures with precision strikes designed to sever the psychic link between the hive mind and its ground forces. This strategy exploits the one true vulnerability in the Tyranid command structure, its dependence on the synaptic network. When synapse creatures are killed, the lesser organisms around them lose their connection to the hive mind and revert to instinctual behavior. Warriors become confused. Gaunts scatter or freeze. Carnifexes charge blindly at the nearest target without regard for tactical positioning. The coordinated or overwhelming swarm becomes a disorganized mob, still dangerous but no longer capable of the precise, directed attacks that make the Tyranids so devastating. The Death Watch kill teams that are deployed against the Tyranids are composed of Marines selected for their ability to operate behind enemy lines, identify high-value targets, and eliminate them with extreme prejudice. They use specialized ammunition and weapons designed specifically to penetrate Tyranid armor and disrupt Tyranid biology. They carry bioacid rounds that dissolve chitin, hellfire rounds that contain a payload of mutagenic acid designed to attack the specific biochemistry of Tyranid organisms, and Kraken penetrator rounds that can punch through the thickest armor plating. Their training includes extensive study of Tyranid biology, behavior, and tactical doctrine. And they drill constantly against simulated Tyranid swarms to maintain the split-second reaction times that are necessary to survive in the seething chaos of a Tyranid engagement. But even the Death Watch, for all their expertise and dedication, can only slow the Tyranid advance. They cannot stop it. No single chapter, no single army, no single strategy can stop the Tyranids, because the Tyranids are not an army. They are an ecosystem. They are a force of biological evolution compressed into a timescale that makes human technology look like the work of cavemen scratching in the dirt. They are the culmination of billions of years of predatory optimization, refined across galaxies and perfected by a consciousness that makes the combined intellectual output of the entire human species look like a child scrawling. And they are coming. Not in some distant theoretical future, but now, today. The Fourth Tyrannic War rages across the Segmentum Pacificus, and new tendrils are being detected on the galaxy's edge with alarming frequency. The main body of the Hive fleet has still not arrived. The fleets that the Imperium has been fighting for 200 years are the Vanguard, the Scouts, the advanced elements of an armada that is still out there in the intergalactic void, moving toward the Milky Way with the patience and inevitability of a glacier. When the main fleet arrives, and it will arrive, nothing the galaxy has seen before will compare. Every Hive fleet the Imperium has fought, every tyrannic war it has survived, every terrible sacrifice it has made to hold the line against the swarm, all of it will be rendered meaningless by the sheer scale of what is coming. Now, the galaxy's inhabitants have been fighting the Tyranids' advance guard and calling it a war. The real war has not yet begun. So let us now address the central question of this discussion. Why are the Tyranids the real threat? Why, in a galaxy filled with chaos gods and Necron overlords and Orc empires and all manner of other existential dangers, are the Tyranids the one faction that truly represents the end of everything? The answer lies in a series of factors that, when taken together, paint a picture so bleak that even the grimdark setting of Warhammer 40,000 struggles to contain it. First, there is the matter of scale. Every Hive fleet that the Imperium has fought, from Behemoth to Leviathan, and all the lesser fleets in between, has been merely a tendril of the main Tyranid swarm. Us Imperial scholars have long theorized that the full extent of the Tyranid species dwarfs anything the galaxy has ever encountered. The Hive fleets that have invaded the Milky Way are scout forces, probing attacks designed to test the galaxy's defenses and harvest genetic material for the main body to analyze. The real invasion, if it can even be called an invasion rather than an extinction-level event, has not yet begun. When the full weight of the Tyranid swarm arrives in the Milky Way, it will not be a war. It will be an apocalypse on a scale that makes the Horus Heresy look like a border skirmish. Second, there is the matter of adaptation. The Tyranids evolve faster than any other species in the galaxy, and every battle fought against them, win or lose, makes them stronger. Every tactic employed against them is analyzed, countered, and filed away for future reference. Every weapon that proves effective is studied and neutralized. Every species that fights them provides genetic material that is incorporated into future bioforms. The Tyranids of the Fourth Tyrannic War are qualitatively different from those of the First, more sophisticated, more adaptable, more dangerous in every measurable way. And the Tyranids of the Fifth War, whenever it comes, will be more dangerous still. Third, there is the matter of sustainability. The Tyranid war machine requires no factories, no supply lines, no mining operations, no logistics infrastructure. Every world they consume provides the raw materials for the next assault. They carry their industry within their own bodies. Yet the Norn Queens producing new bioforms from the biomass of conquered worlds with a speed and efficiency that no factory could match. They do not suffer from morale problems, supply shortages,
or internal politics. They do not need rest, recreation, or reinforcement in the traditional sense. They are a self-sustaining engine of destruction, and every victory they achieve makes them stronger rather than weaker. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, there is the matter of inevitability. The Tyranids cannot be reasoned with. There is no diplomatic solution, no treaty that can be signed, no concession that can be made. They do not want territory, or resources, or political power, or any of the other things that motivate the galaxy's other factions. They want everything, every scrap of organic matter in the galaxy. Yet from the smallest bacterium to the largest civilization is prey. There is no common ground upon which to build a peace, because the Tyranids do not recognize the concept of peace. There is only consumption, only hunger, only the endless, all-consuming drive to devour everything and move on to the next galaxy. Chaos is terrifying, but chaos is ultimately self-defeating. The ruinous powers war against each other as much as they war against the material universe, and their nature as parasites means they need hosts to feed upon. A galaxy completely consumed by chaos would be a galaxy where chaos could no longer sustain itself. The chaos gods need order to corrupt, need hope to crush, need life to torment. In a very real sense, chaos needs the galaxy to survive in some form in order to continue existing. The Necrons are formidable, but they are finite. Their numbers, though vast, are not unlimited. Their technology, though advanced, can be countered, adapted to, worked around. They have internal divisions, competing dynasties, and feuding overlords whose conflicts can be exploited by a sufficiently cunning opponent. And they have goals that extend beyond simple destruction. Many Necron dynasties want to rule the galaxy, not destroy it. There is, at least theoretically, a possibility of coexistence, however uncomfortable. The Orcs are numerous and aggressive, but they lack the strategic coordination to pose an organized, galaxy-spanning threat. Their battle cries and frenzied charges are devastating on a tactical level, but on a strategic level, the Orcs are their own worst enemy, constantly fighting among themselves and dissipating their strength in internecine conflicts. The Imperium has been dealing with the Orc menace for 10,000 years, and while the Greenskins will never be fully eradicated, they can be managed, contained, directed away from critical targets. The Tyranids possess none of these weaknesses. They do not fight among themselves because they are one mind in billions of bodies. They do not have internal politics or competing factions because the hive mind's will is absolute. They do not need the galaxy to survive in any form because they are not from this galaxy, and they can move on to the next one when this one has been consumed. And they are not finite because the main body of their swarm, the full extent of their numbers, is still beyond the galactic rim, is still traveling through the intergalactic void, still coming. And there is one final, deeply unsettling factor that elevates the Tyranids above all other threats. We do not know how many galaxies they have already consumed. The Milky Way may be the 100th galaxy they have devoured, or the 1,000th, or the millionth. We have no way of knowing. All we know is that they have been crossing the intergalactic void for an unfathomable length of time, and that implies they have been feeding for that entire duration. Every galaxy they have consumed has made them larger, more powerful, more sophisticated. The Tyranids that arrived on the rim of the Milky Way are the product of millions or even billions of years of directed evolution, refined by the consumption of potentially thousands of alien civilizations, each one adding its genetic legacy to the ever-growing arsenal of the hive mind. In every sense that matters, the Tyranids are the end of the road. They are the final predator at the top of the galaxy's food chain, the one threat that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be outsmarted, cannot be outproduced, and cannot be outlasted. Every other conflict in the galaxy, every war between the Imperium and Chaos, every Orc invasion, every Aeldari intrigue, every Necron awakening, all of it is, in the grand scheme of things, a sideshow. The main event is the Tyranid invasion, and it has only just begun. That is a sobering thought to end on, but it is the truth of the setting. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and the Tyranids are the reason why that war may one day end not with a victor standing over the defeated, but with silence. The same silence that falls over a world just before it dies. The silence of a galaxy that has been consumed, stripped bare, reduced to nothing but dead rock and cold starlight. And yet, the Imperium fights on. The Space Marines stand their walls. The Imperial Guard holds its lines. Ordinary men and women, armed with nothing but laser guns and faith and the stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable, face the swarm and stand their ground. They fight not because they believe they can win, but because the alternative, to give in, to give up, to lie down and let the darkness take them, is unthinkable. In the face of cosmic horror on a scale that defies comprehension, they choose to resist. They choose to fight. And even if that fight is ultimately futile, even if the mathematics of extinction are inescapable, there is something noble in the refusal to go quietly. The Tyranids may be the real threat. They may be the inevitable end of all things. But until that end comes, until the last star goes dark and the last voice falls silent, there will be those who stand against the great devourer. And their stories, their battles, their sacrifices are worth telling, worth remembering, worth honoring, even in a galaxy where honor is a luxury that few can afford. The shadow is falling, friends. It has been falling for a long time now, creeping closer with each passing year, each passing century, each hive fleet that emerges from the intergalactic void. And one day, that shadow will cover everything. But not today. Today, the galaxy still fights. And as long as it fights, there is hope. Even in the grim darkness of the far future. Even in the face of the Great Devourer. That is what the Tyranids are. That is what they represent. And that is why, of all the threats that crowd the galaxy, they are the one that truly matters. They are the real threat in Warhammer 40,000. They always have been. And until the final chapter of this galaxy's story is written, they always will be. Thank you for listening, friends. Thank you for sitting with me through this long journey into the heart of the Tyranid menace. If you enjoyed this, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps this channel grow, and it helps me continue making content about the stories and lore that we all love so much. If you have thoughts about the Tyranids, about which faction you believe is the true threat, or about any other aspect of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I love hearing from all of you. Until next time, stay safe out there, and if the birds on your world suddenly go quiet, you might want to start running. This is Q on 40,000. See you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.